Corporations are just businesses that got really efficient. They innovate, they compete, they serve customers, and the best ones win. That's capitalism. That's progress. Sure, maybe some of them get too big, maybe they need some regulation, but fundamentally, they're just organizations trying to make products people want. Amazon revolutionized shopping. Google organized the world's information. Apple made technology beautiful. These are success stories. This is what corporations are. You've heard this story your entire life. Maybe you believe it. Maybe you work for a corporation and you're just trying to do your job, help customers, make a decent living. I get it. The story makes sense. It's clean, it's comfortable. And it's a lie. Not because corporations don't make products or serve customers, they do, but because that's not what corporations are. That's what they do to survive in the specific legal and economic environment we created. But at their core, in their DNA, in the blueprint that was written when the first real corporation was born, corporations are something very different. They're not efficient businesses. They're legalized monopolies with a single purpose: extract wealth by any means necessary, including violence, and concentrate that wealth in the hands of shareholders who never have to face consequences for what the corporation does. How do I know this? Because I can show you where corporations came from. Not the sanitized business school version, the real version. The blood-soaked, empire-building, government-toppling, famine-causing origin story that nobody talks about. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every time you hear about Amazon crushing small businesses, Facebook buying competitors, Google lobbying governments, or oil companies funding climate denial, you'll recognize the pattern. Because they're not breaking the system. They're doing exactly what corporations were designed to do from the very beginning.
So let me take you back. December 31st, 1600. London, England, Queen Elizabeth I is about to sign a document that will change the world. Not a declaration of war, not a treaty, not a law, a charter. A piece of paper that gives a group of merchants something that had never existed before. A company with monopoly rights, limited liability, and the power to act as a sovereign state. They called it the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. We know it as the East India Company. And over the next 250 years, this company would build the template for every corporation that exists today. It would conquer territories larger than Europe. It would rule over more people than any empire in history at that time. It would cause famines that killed millions. It would have its own armies, navies, and currencies. It would become richer than countries. And then it would crash, get bailed out by the government, dissolve, and pass its DNA into every modern corporation that came after. This isn't ancient history that has nothing to do with you. This is the origin story of the world you live in. This is why corporations have more power than governments. This is why they can lobby, influence, and sometimes outright control policy. This is why they're legally required to prioritize shareholder profit over everything else, including human life. This is why Too Big to Fail exists. The East India Company wrote the playbook. Modern corporations just follow it. And if we don't understand where corporations came from, we can't understand why they behave the way they do today. And we definitely can't fix the problems they create. So that's what this is about. Not just the history of one company, but the origin of corporate capitalism itself. How a business model based on monopoly, violence, and extraction became the dominant economic system on Earth. How the men who ran this company stole wealth on a scale that makes modern billionaires look like amateurs. How they invented the techniques of lobbying, regulatory capture, stock manipulation, and corporate bailouts that we see every day now. And how they got away with it, not despite the system, but because they built the system to let them get away with it. I spent 4 months researching this, read books by historians who dedicated their lives to understanding the East India Company, looked at primary sources, the actual letters and reports these men wrote describing what they were doing, examined economic data showing the wealth flows, traced the legal structures they created. And what I found was this. Everything you think you know about corporations, about capitalism, about how business works, it's incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. The real story is so much darker, so much more violent, and so much more relevant to today than I ever imagined. And here's the thing that kept me up at night while researching this. The East India Company didn't fail because the model was bad. It failed because it succeeded too much, extracted too fast, and became so powerful that even the British government got nervous. But the model itself, the corporate structure, the shareholder capitalism, the limited liability, the monopoly ambitions, the use of state violence for private profit, that model survived. That model is what we live under today. We just don't call it the East India Company anymore. We call it Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, ExxonMobil, BlackRock. Different names, same DNA. Let me set the scene, because you need to understand what the world looked like before the East India Company existed to appreciate how radically it changed everything. In 1600, the global economy worked very differently than it does today. There were merchants, obviously. There were traders who would buy goods in one place and sell them in another. There were guilds that controlled crafts and trades in cities. There were partnerships where a few people would pool money for a specific venture, like sending a ship to trade, and then dissolve the partnership when the ship returned and profits were split. But there was no such thing as a corporation in the modern sense. No permanent organization that existed separately from the people who owned it. No limited liability where owners couldn't be held responsible for what the business did. No tradable shares that turned ownership into a commodity. And definitely no companies with the legal right to raise armies, make war, and govern territories. The world economy in 1600 was dominated by trade, but trade worked differently than it does now. The most valuable goods were things you couldn't get locally. Spices like pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon came from very specific places, mainly Southeast Asia, the Spice Islands, what we now call Indonesia. These spices were worth more than gold by weight in Europe because they preserved food, made terrible tasting preserved food edible, and were status symbols for the wealthy. Silk, cotton, tea, and porcelain came from Asia, from China, India, and Persia, and Europeans wanted these goods desperately. But they had a problem. They didn't control the trade routes. Those routes were controlled by Muslim merchants, by the Ottoman Empire, by the Venetians who acted as middlemen, and by the Portuguese who had recently established a sea route around Africa to Asia. If you were an English merchant and you wanted spices, you had to buy them from multiple middlemen, each taking a cut, making the final price astronomical. So, English merchants were looking for a way to cut out the middlemen and trade directly with Asia. But here's the problem they faced. Sending a ship to Asia was incredibly expensive and incredibly risky. It cost a fortune to build and outfit a ship. The journey took years around the southern tip of Africa, across the Indian Ocean to India or beyond. Ships were lost to storms, pirates, disease, and navigation errors. Even if your ship made it to Asia, you might not be able to trade because Portuguese or Dutch competitors might block you, or local rulers might not want to deal with you. And if your ship did make it back with goods, the profits were enormous, but one successful voyage didn't mean the next one would succeed. So individual merchants couldn't sustain this trade alone. They needed to pool resources and share risk. This is where the corporate form became attractive. If you could create a permanent organization that pooled the wealth of many investors, you could send multiple ships, absorb the loss if some failed, and make sustained profits over time. And if you could get a monopoly charter from the government, you could eliminate English competition and guarantee all the profits from this trade went to your organization. This wasn't a new idea. The Dutch had already done it. In 1602, just 2 years after the English East India Company was founded, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, would become even more powerful than its English counterpart for a while. But in 1600, the English merchants were racing to establish their own monopoly before the Dutch locked them out entirely. So they petitioned Queen Elizabeth I. They asked for a royal charter granting them a monopoly on all English trade with the East Indies. And on the last day of 1600, Elizabeth granted it.
She gave them a 15-year monopoly on all trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan, which basically meant all of Asia. She gave them the right to make laws governing their employees and settlements. She gave them the right to use military force to defend their trade. And critically, she gave them a legal structure that separated the company from the individuals who owned it. The company could own property, sign contracts, and sue or be sued as if it were a person, but the individual shareholders had limited liability, meaning if the company failed or did something terrible, the shareholders couldn't be held personally responsible beyond losing their investment. Now, pause for a second and think about what this means. Elizabeth just created a legal person that can own things, make rules, and use violence, but no actual human is fully responsible for what it does. The shareholders elect directors. The directors appoint managers. The managers make decisions. If those decisions lead to disaster or atrocity, everyone can point to someone else. I just followed company policy. I just did what shareholders demanded. I just followed orders. This diffusion of responsibility is built into the corporate structure from day one, and it's not an accident, it's a feature. Because if you're going to do risky, morally questionable, or outright violent things to make profit, you need a legal structure that protects you from consequences. And that's exactly what the corporate charter provided. The men who founded the East India Company weren't cartoonish villains. They were merchants, many of them quite successful already, and they saw a business opportunity. They weren't setting out to conquer India or cause famines, at least not at first. They just wanted to trade. But here's the thing about systems. The incentives matter more than the intentions. The structure of the corporation, monopoly rights, limited liability, shareholder profit as the primary goal, created incentives that would lead to more and more extreme actions. Because if your only mandate is profit, and you have legal monopoly, and you have limited liability, and you have the right to use violence, what's going to stop you from using that violence when it becomes profitable? Nothing. Not morality, because corporations don't have morality. Not law, because you'll lobby to change laws in your favor. Not competition, because you have a monopoly. The only limit is how much violence you can deploy before it becomes counterproductive. And the East India Company spent 250 years testing that limit.
The first voyage of the East India Company left England in February 1601. 5 ships, 500 men, carrying silver and gold to trade for spices. They sailed around Africa, across the Indian Ocean, and reached Sumatra and then Java in Indonesia. And they actually succeeded. They traded with local rulers, bought spices, and returned to England in 1603 with ships full of pepper. The voyage made an 87% profit for investors. 87%! For context, if you make 7% annually on a stock investment today, you're doing great. These guys made 87% on one voyage. So naturally, they sent more ships, more voyages, more profits. But they quickly ran into problems. The Dutch were already there, and they weren't interested in sharing. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was larger, better funded, and more ruthless than the English. They had already established fortified trading posts throughout Southeast Asia. They had treaties with local rulers, and they made it very clear that English ships were not welcome. There were skirmishes, blockades, and in 1623 a notorious incident on the island of Amboina, where the Dutch tortured and executed 10 English merchants on accusations of conspiracy. The English East India Company couldn't compete with the Dutch in the Spice Islands. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered. So the English company pivoted. If they couldn't dominate the spice trade, they'd focus on India. India had cotton, silk, indigo, saltpeter, which is used for gunpowder, and eventually tea. The Mughal Empire controlled most of India, and it was one of the richest, most powerful empires in the world. The Mughal emperor had more wealth than any European king. Indian textiles were the finest in the world. Indian agriculture was productive. Indian cities were larger than London. This wasn't some backward region waiting to be civilized, which is how Victorian historians later portrayed it. This was a wealthy, sophisticated civilization that Europeans wanted access to, because India had things Europe needed. The East India Company established its first trading post in Surat on the west coast of India in 1608. They had to negotiate with the Mughal emperor for trading rights. The emperor granted permission because he saw the English as relatively weak and potentially useful as a counterweight to Portuguese influence. The English were allowed to trade, but they had no political power. They were merchants operating under Mughal authority, paying taxes and tariffs like everyone else. And for the first half of the 1600s, that's mostly what they remained, traders. They built trading posts called factories in coastal cities. They shipped Indian goods back to England. They made profits, but they didn't rule anything. They were a business, not a government. But here's where the story starts to change, and this is the call to adventure in the hero's journey, except the hero is a corporation and the adventure is conquest. Throughout the mid-1600s, the company kept running into a problem. Trading was profitable but unpredictable. Local rulers could raise taxes, rival traders could undercut prices, supply could be disrupted by war or politics. The company couldn't control the conditions of trade as long as they were just one actor in a larger system. So company officials started thinking, what if we didn't just trade? What if we controlled the territory where the goods were produced? What if we made the rules instead of following them? What if we stopped being a company operating in India and became a company that owned India?
This wasn't official company policy at first. It was individual officials, men stationed in India thousands of miles from London, making decisions that would slowly transform the company from a trading operation into a military power. And the incentive structure of the corporation enabled this. These men were paid partly in salary, but mostly in commissions on trade. The more they traded and the better the terms, the richer they got. So they had every reason to push boundaries, take risks, and use whatever methods increased trade volume and profit margins. If that meant making alliances with local rulers, great. If it meant raising a private army, even better. And if it meant eventually conquering territory, well, the shareholders back in London wouldn't complain as long as dividends kept coming. The turning point began with a seemingly minor decision. In the 1660s, the Mughal Empire started to fragment. Local governors became more independent, succession disputes created instability, and the East India Company, along with other European traders, realized that this instability was an opportunity. They started hiring soldiers, not just guards for warehouses, but actual military forces, sepoys, Indian soldiers trained in European military tactics and equipped with European weapons, commanded by British officers. At first, this was justified as defense. We need to protect our trading posts from bandits and rivals. But once you have an army, it's really tempting to use it for more than defense. In 1686, the company declared war on the Mughal Empire. Yes, you read that right. A corporation declared war on one of the most powerful empires in the world. Why? Because the Mughal emperor had increased customs duties, and the company thought this was unfair. So company officials, without explicit authorization from London, decided to use their private army to force the Mughals to give them better trade terms. It went badly. The company was crushed. The Mughal emperor could have expelled them from India entirely, but he chose to be merciful, probably because he saw them as a minor nuisance. The company officials had to grovel, pay fines, and accept humiliation. But here's the lesson the company learned. Military force didn't work when you were weak. But what if you got stronger? What if you built a bigger army? What if you waited for the Mughal Empire to weaken further? What if you played local rulers against each other, allied with some against others, and slowly expanded your power? That was the strategy going forward. And it would take another 70 years to fully implement, but by the mid-1700s, the East India Company would go from humiliated supplicant to the dominant military power in India. And that transformation, that's what Chapter 2 is about. The conquest. The moment when a corporation stopped pretending to be a business and revealed itself as an empire.
But before we get to the battles and the conquests, I need you to think about something. Something that's going to echo through this entire story and into the present day. The East India Company could have stayed a trading company. They were making profits. They could have just kept buying and selling goods, operating within the rules set by local governments, and enriching shareholders without violence. But they didn't.
And the reason they didn't isn't because the specific men running the company were uniquely evil. It's because the structure of the corporation created incentives for expansion, control, and domination. Profit is good, but monopoly profit is better. Trading is profitable, but owning the means of production is more profitable. Following rules set by others is acceptable, but making the rules yourself is optimal. Every corporation faces this logic. Amazon started as an online bookstore, just selling books. But selling books meant they needed logistics, so they built warehouses. And once they had warehouses, they could sell more than books. And once they dominated online retail, they could create their own marketplace. And once they had the marketplace, they could use data from sellers to create competing products. And once they had enough power, they could lobby governments for tax breaks and subsidies. At each step, expansion and control were more profitable than staying small and playing fair. Amazon isn't doing anything the East India Company didn't do. They're following the same logic. The technology is different, the methods are different, but the underlying incentive structure is identical. Corporations expand, consolidate, and seek control because that's what the corporate form incentivizes. And here's the question, the deeper problem I mentioned at the beginning. Do we accept this? Do we accept that corporations, by their nature, will seek monopoly power and use whatever methods are available, including lobbying, regulatory capture, and in the case of the East India Company, literal military conquest? Or do we recognize that the corporate form, as it was designed in 1600 and as it exists today, is fundamentally incompatible with democracy, competition, and human welfare? Because you can't have corporations that are legally required to maximize shareholder profit and also expect them to voluntarily restrain themselves. The restraint has to come from outside, from governments, from regulations, from public pressure. But what happens when corporations become powerful enough to control governments? What happens when they can write the regulations that are supposed to restrain them? What happens when they become richer than countries and can play nations against each other? The East India Company faced no effective external restraint for most of its existence. The British government granted it monopoly powers and then let it do whatever it wanted as long as tax revenue and valuable goods kept flowing back to Britain. And without restraint, the company became a monster. It conquered, plundered, caused famines, and ruled with violence. And when it finally collapsed, the British government didn't say, maybe the corporate model is flawed. They said, let's take over what the company built and keep running the empire ourselves. The model didn't fail. It succeeded so well that the government wanted in on the action. And that's what we're going to explore in the next 4 chapters. How the company conquered India, how it ruled, how it extracted wealth on a scale that's hard to comprehend, how it crashed, and how its legacy lives on in every corporation that exists today. This isn't just history. This is the origin story of the world you live in, the world where corporations have more wealth than countries, where they lobby governments to write laws in their favor, where they use every available method to maximize profit regardless of human cost, where too big to fail means taxpayers bail out corporations when they crash. All of that started here, with a charter signed on the last day of 1600 by Queen Elizabeth I, creating a legal person with rights but no conscience, power but no accountability, and a mandate to pursue profit by any means necessary.
And now that you know where it started, you'll never see corporations the same way again. When you hear about corporate lobbying, you'll think about the East India Company lobbying Parliament. When you hear about corporations privatizing public services, you'll think about the company taking over government functions in India. When you hear about regulatory capture, you'll think about how the company wrote the regulations governing trade. When you hear about stock manipulation, you'll think about the company inflating share prices. When you hear about bailouts, you'll think about the British government taking over the company's debts. It's all there, the entire playbook, written in blood and treasure over 250 years. So let's keep going. Let's see how a trading company became an empire. Let's watch as profit motive combined with legal monopoly and military force created one of history's greatest atrocities. Let's trace the line from the East India Company to the modern corporation, and let's confront the question, if this is what corporations are, not what we wish they were, but what they actually are based on how they were designed and how they've behaved throughout history, then what the hell do we do about it? That's the journey we're on, and I'm warning you now, it gets darker before it gets better. Chapter 2 is about conquest. Real conquest, a corporation waging war, defeating empires, and ruling over millions of people. If you thought corporations were just businesses, you're about to see what they become when nobody stops them.
Let me tell you about Robert Clive. Not because he's a hero, he's absolutely not, but because he's the perfect embodiment of what the East India Company became in the 1700s. Clive arrived in India in 1744 as a low-level clerk for the company. He was 18 years old, depressed, had tried to kill himself twice in England, and was sent to India basically because his family didn't know what else to do with him. He had no military training, no aristocratic background, no particular skills. He was nobody. But he had something that mattered more than any of that in the corporate structure of the East India Company. He had ambition, he had no moral restraints, and he understood that the company rewarded results, not methods. Within 13 years, this clerk would command armies, defeat emperors, loot treasuries, and personally acquire wealth equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars today. And the company would celebrate him for it, because Robert Clive made shareholders rich. That's the story of this chapter, how the East India Company went from merchants paying taxes to Indian rulers to conquerors extracting tribute from India. How a corporation built an army that defeated one of the world's great empires. How profit motive, combined with military force and a complete absence of accountability, created a machine of extraction so efficient and so brutal that it would drain India of wealth for 2 centuries. And how all of this was legal, encouraged, and rewarded by the corporate structure we are still using today. Let's set the stage, because the India of the early 1700s was not some easy target waiting to be conquered. The Mughal Empire, which had ruled most of India since the 1500s, was weakening, but it was still one of the wealthiest polities on earth. The Mughal emperor's treasury contained more gold and jewels than all of Europe combined. Indian textiles, particularly cotton, were the finest in the world and were exported to Europe, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Indian agriculture was highly productive, supporting a population of over 150 million people, which was more than all of Europe at the time. Indian mathematics, astronomy, and architecture were advanced. The Taj Mahal, built in the mid-1600s, was more sophisticated than anything being built in Europe at the same time. This is important to understand because the narrative you've probably heard, that Europeans civilized a backward India, is complete nonsense, racist propaganda invented later to justify conquest. The India that the East India Company began to conquer in the 1700s was richer than Britain. The conquest wasn't civilization defeating barbarism, it was a corporation using military force to steal from a wealthier civilization. But the Mughal Empire was fragmenting. After the death of Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707, the empire broke into semi-independent regions ruled by nawabs and princes who technically owed allegiance to the Mughal emperor in Delhi but were effectively independent. This created the classic conditions for European intervention, a wealthy region with political fragmentation where Europeans could play different factions against each other. And the East India Company, along with the French East India Company, which was also operating in India, saw this fragmentation as an opportunity. If you could ally with one local ruler against another, you could demand concessions for your support. If you provided military assistance, you could demand trading privileges, tax exemptions, or even territory. And if you were really ambitious, you could use those alliances to eventually take control yourself. This is exactly what the East India Company did, and Robert Clive was the man who perfected the technique. Clive's rise began almost by accident during a war between the British and French East India Companies in the 1740s and 1750s. Yes, 2 corporations were fighting a war in India as proxies for their home governments, who were also at war in Europe. This is important. The company had become so militarized that it was waging wars as a normal part of business operations.
Clive, the clerk, volunteered for military service because military officers got more pay and more opportunity for prize money, which is a polite term for loot. He turned out to be good at it, not because he was a brilliant tactician, though he was competent, but because he was ruthless, willing to take risks, and understood that European military discipline and firepower gave small European forces a significant advantage over larger but less coordinated Indian forces. In 1751, Clive led a force of 200 European soldiers and 300 sepoys, Indian soldiers employed by the company, to capture and hold the fortress of Arcot against a force of 10,000. He won, mostly through bluff, bribery, and the psychological impact of disciplined European artillery fire. And that victory made his reputation. Suddenly, Clive was the company's military specialist, the man who could win against the odds, the man who could turn military force into commercial advantage. But the real transformation came in Bengal, the richest province in India, in 1756. Bengal was ruled by a young Nawab named Siraj Uddaula, who was 23 years old and had just inherited power. He looked around his province and saw European trading companies, British and French, building fortifications, raising armies, and acting increasingly independent of his authority. They weren't just merchants anymore. They were fortifying their trading posts like military bases, and they were interfering in local politics. So Siraj Uddaula did what any sovereign ruler would do. He told them to stop. He demanded the Europeans dismantle their new fortifications and acknowledge his authority. The French complied. The British East India Company refused. Why? Because company officials believed they were powerful enough to ignore the Nawab. They had their own army, they had fortified positions, they had support from some of the Nawab's rivals, and they assumed that a 23-year-old ruler wouldn't actually do anything about their defiance. They were wrong.
In June 1756, Siraj Uddaula attacked the company's fortification at Calcutta with a force of 30,000 soldiers. The company's forces, vastly outnumbered and unprepared, retreated or surrendered. The Nawab's forces captured the fort, and in the chaos, over 100 British prisoners were crammed into a small prison cell overnight. It was June in India, unbearably hot, and the cell was tiny. By morning, most of them were dead from heat, suffocation, and dehydration. This became known as the Black Hole of Calcutta, and it was turned into a massive propaganda event in Britain. The reality was that it was probably a tragic accident born of confusion and overcrowding, not a deliberate atrocity. The Nawab likely didn't even know the prisoners were in those conditions, but the company used it to paint Siraj Uddaula as a monster and to justify what came next: revenge, conquest, and plunder on a scale that would dwarf anything the Nawab had done. The East India Company sent Robert Clive from Madras to Bengal with a force of 900 European soldiers and 1,500 sepoys. That's it. About 2,400 men total to confront an army of tens of thousands. But Clive didn't plan to win through military superiority. He planned to win through bribery, treachery, and one decisive battle that would break the Nawab's power. And this is where you see the corporate logic at work. Clive could have negotiated. The Nawab was willing to restore trading rights. But negotiation would just return things to the status quo, where the company operated under the Nawab's authority. That wasn't good enough. Clive wanted the company to be the authority, and the way to achieve that was to replace the Nawab with someone who owed everything to the company. So Clive conspired with Mir Jafar, one of the Nawab's senior generals, and offered him a deal: betray the Nawab during battle, and the company would make Mir Jafar the new Nawab of Bengal. In exchange, Mir Jafar would give the company massive trading concessions, territorial control, and a huge payment from the Bengal treasury. Mir Jafar agreed. The deal was struck, and on June 23, 1757, at a place called Plassey, Clive's tiny force faced the Nawab's army of over 50,000 soldiers. The Battle of Plassey is taught in British schools as a great military victory. It wasn't. It was a corporate coup executed through bribery. When the battle began, Mir Jafar, commanding a large portion of the Nawab's forces, simply didn't fight. He kept his troops stationary and waited. The Nawab's remaining forces, confused and demoralized by this betrayal, fought briefly but then broke and retreated. Clive's forces pursued, the Nawab was captured a few days later and executed, and Mir Jafar was installed as the new Nawab of Bengal.
Except he wasn't really the ruler. He was a puppet. The East India Company was now the real power in Bengal. They controlled the army, they controlled the treasury, they controlled trade, and they controlled the new Nawab, who owed his position entirely to them. This is the moment. This is when a corporation stopped being a business operating within a state and became the state itself. And everything that happens after this, all the extraction, all the famines, all the wealth drain, flows from this moment when corporate logic, maximize profit by any means, merged with military and political power.
Let me give you the numbers because they're staggering. After Plassey, the company looted the Bengal treasury. Mir Jafar had agreed to pay the company £2.5 million as part of the deal, which is roughly £370 million today, or about $450 million. But that was just the official payment. Company officials, including Clive personally, took additional gifts. Clive personally received £234,000, which is about £35 million or $42 million today. Other company officials received similar payments. The total amount extracted immediately after Plassey was probably over £5 million, which is close to $1 billion in today's money, from one victory that wasn't even really a battle. And this was just the beginning, because now the company didn't just trade in Bengal, they controlled it. And controlling territory meant they could extract tribute, collect taxes, and set the terms of trade entirely in their favor. The profit potential was limitless, and the shareholders in London were thrilled. Dividends soared, company stock prices shot up, and nobody in London asked uncomfortable questions about how this wealth was being acquired because the corporate structure provided perfect cover. The company delivered profits. How they were obtained was an operational detail. Robert Clive became obscenely wealthy and returned to Britain as a hero. Parliament celebrated him. He bought a massive estate. He became a baron. This is crucial. He wasn't punished for using military force to overthrow a sovereign ruler. He wasn't prosecuted for looting. He was rewarded, he was lionized, because from the perspective of the British establishment, Clive had done something remarkable. He'd made a corporation powerful enough to control one of the richest regions in the world, and that meant wealth flowing to Britain, tax revenue for the British government, and proof that British power, even when exercised through a corporation, could dominate non-European powers. The fact that this was achieved through betrayal, bribery, and violence was irrelevant. Results mattered. Profits mattered. And the East India Company, under Clive's model, was delivering both. But let's talk about what this meant for Bengal, because this is where the corporate extraction model reveals its true horror. Bengal was prosperous before the company took control. It had a functioning economy, a tax system that wasn't particularly oppressive by pre-modern standards, and a population that was generally able to feed itself and engage in trade. But the East India Company wasn't interested in governing Bengal well. They were interested in extracting maximum revenue as quickly as possible. So they took over the tax collection system, which was called the Diwani in 1765. This gave the company the legal right to collect all taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, a region with over 30 million people, and the company immediately increased tax rates. Not to provide better services, there were no services, the company wasn't building schools or hospitals or infrastructure, they were increasing taxes to maximize the revenue that could be sent back to London as dividends to shareholders. And they did this through a system that was deliberately extractive and brutal. Here's how it worked. The company appointed tax collectors, often company employees or British officials, who were given collection targets. If you collected the target, you kept your job and got a bonus. If you exceeded the target, you got a bigger bonus. If you fell short, you were fired or worse. This created an incentive system where tax collectors squeezed every possible penny out of the population regardless of whether people could actually afford to pay. If there was a drought and harvests failed, the tax demand didn't decrease. If people couldn't pay in cash, their goods were seized. If they still couldn't pay, they were forced to sell land or borrow at usurious rates.
The entire system was designed for extraction efficiency, not for the welfare of the people being taxed. And because the company's tax collectors were British or British-backed, there was no accountability. If you were a Bengali farmer and a tax collector was abusing you, who were you going to complain to? The company? They set the quotas. The Nawab? He was a puppet. The Mughal emperor in Delhi? He had no power in Bengal anymore. There was no recourse. The system was designed to be inescapable. And the wealth extracted was enormous. In the decade after the company took over tax collection, they extracted an estimated £5 million per year from Bengal. To put that in context, the entire revenue of the British government at the time was about £8 million per year. A single province in India was generating more than half of what the entire British government collected. And where did this money go? It didn't stay in Bengal to be invested in development. It flowed to London. It went to shareholders as dividends. It went to company officials as salaries and bonuses. It went to the British government as customs duties on goods shipped from India. Bengal was being drained, and the consequences were predictable and catastrophic. By the late 1760s, Bengal was in economic crisis. The aggressive tax collection had destroyed the agricultural economy. Farmers couldn't invest in their land because everything was taken in taxes. Artisans couldn't get raw materials because the company monopolized trade. Markets were disrupted because the company controlled prices. And then, in 1769, the rains failed. Drought. Harvests failed across Bengal. And normally, in a functioning economy with reserves and a government that cared about the population, a drought would cause hardship but not mass death. But Bengal in 1769 was not a functioning economy. The company had extracted so much wealth that there were no reserves. And the company, faced with a drought and famine, did something unthinkable. They kept collecting taxes at the same rate. Let me say that again because it's important. Bengal was experiencing famine. People were starving, and the East India Company continued to collect taxes at the usual rates because they didn't want revenues to drop and they didn't want to disappoint shareholders. Company officials in Bengal sent letters to London explaining that the famine was reducing population, which would reduce future tax revenue, and asking if they should lower tax demands. The response from London was maintain revenue. The shareholders and directors in London, thousands of miles away, who would never see the consequences of their decisions, decided that short-term profit was more important than the lives of millions of people. And the result was the Great Bengal Famine of 1770. Over the course of about a year, approximately 10 million people died. 10 million. That's 1/3 of the population of Bengal. 1/3. Dead from starvation, while the East India Company continued to extract taxes and ship wealth back to Britain.
And here's the thing that makes this even more horrifying. This wasn't hidden. People in Britain knew. There were reports in newspapers. Company officials wrote about it. Robert Clive, by this time back in England, was questioned by Parliament about the company's role in the famine, and his defense was essentially, "We were just collecting taxes. We didn't cause the drought. The famine was an act of God." And Parliament accepted this because the alternative was to hold the company accountable, which would mean questioning the entire system of corporate extraction that was making Britain wealthy. So instead, the famine was blamed on Indian overpopulation, backwardness, and the inherent poverty of India, completely ignoring the fact that Bengal had been prosperous before the company took over and was devastated after. This narrative that India was poor and backward became the justification for continued British rule. We need to civilize them. We need to teach them better agriculture. We need to govern them because they can't govern themselves. It was a lie built on top of an atrocity, designed to obscure the fact that the poverty was created by extraction, not by any inherent Indian failing. Now, let's connect this to today, because this pattern, corporate extraction causing crisis, corporation avoiding accountability, narrative created to blame victims, this pattern repeats over and over. When corporations pollute water supplies and people get sick, the corporations blame the victims for not boiling water or living in the wrong place. When corporations pay starvation wages and people can't afford food, the corporations blame the workers for not having skills or working hard enough. When corporations crash the economy through reckless financial behavior and people lose their homes, the corporations get bailouts and blame the homeowners for taking out bad mortgages. The playbook hasn't changed. Extract as much as possible. When extraction causes harm, deny responsibility, blame the victims, change the narrative, and continue extracting. The East India Company pioneered this playbook in Bengal in the 1760s and 1770s, and every corporation since has studied it, consciously or not. Let me give you another direct parallel. The East India Company's tax collection system in Bengal was designed to hit targets regardless of economic conditions. Modern corporations have quarterly earnings targets that must be hit regardless of economic conditions. If a corporation is facing a downturn, do they lower profit targets and accept lower returns to shareholders? No. They lay off workers, cut wages, reduce quality, or find other ways to maintain profit margins. The workers suffer. The customers suffer. The shareholders don't. This is the same logic the East India Company used. The Bengali farmers and weavers suffered. The shareholders in London didn't. In fact, the shareholders prospered. Company stock prices were at all-time highs in the late 1760s, right as millions were starving in Bengal, because the people making the decisions, the shareholders and directors in London, were geographically and psychologically separated from the consequences of those decisions. They saw numbers on a balance sheet. They didn't see corpses in the streets of Calcutta. And that separation, that abstraction, is built into the corporate structure. It allows people to do things through a corporation that they would never do personally because they never have to confront the human cost.
Robert Clive, when questioned by Parliament in 1772, said something revealing. He was asked if he felt any responsibility for the suffering in Bengal, and his answer was, "I followed my duty to the company and the shareholders. I maximized revenue as I was instructed to do. If there were problems with how that revenue was collected, that's a matter for the directors." See the deflection? He was following orders. He was doing his job. He wasn't responsible for the consequences. The system was. And the directors said the same thing. They were following their duty to shareholders. They were maximizing returns. If the methods caused suffering, well, that was unfortunate, but it wasn't their fault. They were just operating within the system. And the shareholders said they were just investors. They didn't control day-to-day operations. They just expected returns on their investment. Everyone in the chain could point to someone else and say, "Not my responsibility." This is the diffusion of responsibility that the corporate structure creates. It's not a bug, it's a feature. Because if everyone is a little bit responsible, then no one is truly accountable. And this is the deeper problem emerging more clearly now. We've built an economic system where the most powerful actors, corporations, are structured specifically to avoid accountability. They're legal persons with rights, but without the moral constraints that govern actual persons. They are required by law to prioritize profit. They're owned by shareholders who are geographically and psychologically distant from the consequences of corporate actions. And they're run by managers who are incentivized to hit short-term targets regardless of long-term harm. This structure produces predictable results: extraction, exploitation, externalization of costs, and avoidance of responsibility. The East India Company did this in Bengal. United Fruit did it in Guatemala. Oil companies do it with climate change. Tech companies do it with data privacy and mental health. Pharmaceutical companies do it with opioids. It's the same pattern. The specific industries and methods change, but the underlying logic remains the same. Maximize shareholder value, externalize costs onto others, avoid accountability. And when the harm becomes undeniable, change the narrative and blame someone else. But here's what you might be thinking. Okay, the East India Company was bad, but surely modern corporations can't get away with causing famines or overthrowing governments. And that's partially true. The regulatory environment is different. But let me ask you this. Why do we need regulations to prevent corporations from causing mass harm? Why isn't the fact that causing mass harm is morally wrong sufficient to prevent it? And the answer is because corporations don't have morality. They have incentives. And if the incentive is profit and causing harm is profitable or allows you to avoid costs, then corporations will cause harm unless they're prevented from doing so by external force. Regulations are that external force, but regulations only work if they're enforced, and they're only enforced if governments have the will and capacity to enforce them. And governments only have that will and capacity if they're not captured by corporate influence. And that's the trap we're in now, the same trap Britain was in during the East India Company era. The corporation became so wealthy and powerful that it could influence the government that was supposed to regulate it. The company had directors in Parliament. It loaned money to the British government. It lobbied for favorable legislation. It was, in many ways, more powerful than the government that had chartered it.
And by the 1770s, this created a crisis. Not a moral crisis. The British establishment didn't care about the moral implications of the Bengal famine, but a financial and political crisis. Because the East India Company, despite extracting enormous wealth from India, was somehow going broke. How is that possible? How do you control one of the richest regions in the world, extract millions in taxes and trade revenue, and still end up bankrupt? The answer reveals everything about how corporations work and why they're fundamentally unstable. The company was extracting wealth from India, but that wealth wasn't being saved or invested wisely. It was being paid out as dividends to shareholders. It was being used to pay inflated salaries and bonuses to company officials. It was being spent on wars with rival European powers and Indian states. It was being lost to corruption because company officials were embezzling massive amounts. And it was being wasted on stock manipulation schemes, where company directors would artificially inflate stock prices, sell their shares, and leave ordinary investors holding worthless paper. By the early 1770s, the company was in debt, couldn't pay its bills, and was facing collapse. And this created a problem for the British government, because if the company collapsed, it would take down a lot of British investors, disrupt trade, and potentially lose Britain's foothold in India. So in 1773, the British government did something that should sound very familiar to anyone who lived through 2008. They bailed out the company. The Regulating Act of 1773 gave the company a massive loan, imposed some government oversight, but fundamentally preserved the company's power and structure. The government didn't say, this corporate model is broken and we need to replace it. They said, the company is too important to fail, so we'll rescue it and try to make it behave a little better. Does this sound familiar? Banks in 2008 were bailed out because they were too big to fail. Auto companies were bailed out. The structure that created the crisis was preserved because the alternative, letting them fail and dealing with the consequences, was too scary for governments to contemplate. So the system that creates crises gets rescued, and then it creates the next crisis. The East India Company would stumble along for another 80 years, causing more famines, more wars, and more extraction, until finally the British government decided to just take over directly in 1858 after a massive rebellion. But even then, the corporate model didn't die, it just evolved. Let me end this chapter by bringing us back to Robert Clive, because his ending is revealing. After being celebrated as a hero in the 1760s, by the 1770s, public opinion started to turn against him. The Bengal famine created bad publicity. Reports of company corruption became too widespread to ignore, and Clive, as the face of the company's conquest, became a target. He was put on trial by Parliament in 1773, not for causing the famine, but for corruption and self-dealing. And during the trial, he gave a famous line, "I stand astonished at my own moderation." What he meant was, I could have taken so much more. I could have looted the entire Bengal treasury. I showed restraint by only taking a few million. And he genuinely believed this. He thought he deserved praise for not stealing everything. This is the mindset that the corporate structure creates. The only measure of success is, did you maximize extraction? And if you could have taken more but didn't, you showed admirable restraint. The idea that you shouldn't take anything that isn't yours, that you shouldn't use violence to enrich yourself, that you have some responsibility to the people you're governing, these ideas don't even enter the equation. Clive was acquitted by Parliament. He was celebrated again, but he was also deeply depressed, addicted to opium, and haunted by what he'd done, whether from guilt or just the stress of being a public target. In 1774, at the age of 49, Robert Clive killed himself. Depending on who you ask, it was either an overdose or he slit his throat.
Either way, the man who had conquered Bengal, looted its treasury, and pioneered the model of corporate imperialism died miserable and alone.
But the company he built kept going. The extraction kept going. The famines kept happening. And the model he perfected, using corporate structure to enable conquest and extraction while avoiding accountability, that model spread. It became the template for British imperialism. It became the template for corporate capitalism. And it's still the template today. Clive is dead. The East India Company is dead. But the logic they embodied, maximize shareholder value by any means available, externalize costs, avoid accountability, that logic is alive and well in every boardroom in the world. And until we confront that logic and the structure that enables it, we're going to keep seeing the same patterns repeat. Different industries, different geographies, different victims, but the same underlying dynamic. Concentrated power, legal impunity, and profit motive, creating systems that extract, exploit, and destroy. So now you understand how the company conquered. In Chapter 3, we're going to look at how they ruled. What does it look like when a corporation becomes a government? What happens when profit motive governs millions of people? How much wealth can you extract before the system collapses? And what happens when a corporate state faces resistance? Because the people of India didn't just accept this quietly, they fought back. And that resistance and the company's response to it reveals even more about what corporations are willing to do when their profits are threatened. That's where we're going next, the rule of the corporate state. And I'm warning you, it gets worse before it gets better.
Here's a question I want you to really think about. What happens when a corporation runs a country? Not influences a country, not lobbies a country, actually runs it, controls the laws, collects the taxes, commands the army, and administers justice. What does that look like? Because we have a near-perfect historical example, and the answer is horrifying in ways that should terrify anyone who thinks corporations should have less regulation and more freedom. From 1770 to 1858, the East India Company functioned as the government of large parts of India. They had territory the size of Western Europe. They ruled over 200 million people at their peak, which was more than the population of all of Western Europe combined. They had an army of 300,000 soldiers, which was twice the size of the British Army. They collected taxes, ran courts, made laws, fought wars, and executed criminals. They were, in every meaningful sense, a state. Except they weren't accountable to the people they governed. They were accountable to shareholders in London. And that single difference, accountability to shareholders rather than citizens, shaped every decision they made and created a system of governance so extractive, so brutal, and so economically destructive that it turned one of the richest regions on Earth into one of the poorest. And the crazy thing, the thing that should make us question everything about how we've organized the modern economy, is that the company wasn't acting abnormally. They weren't violating corporate principles. They were following them perfectly. Maximize revenue, minimize costs, extract maximum value, return profits to shareholders. Every terrible thing they did as a government flowed logically from their structure as a corporation. And that's the horror we need to confront in this chapter. Let's start with what happened after the Bengal famine of 1770, because you'd think that killing 10 million people through extractive tax policy would prompt some kind of systemic change. It didn't. The British government imposed some oversight through the Regulating Act of 1773, but the fundamental model didn't change. The company still controlled Bengal, they still collected taxes, they still prioritized shareholder returns. And within a decade, Bengal was hit by another famine, and then another, and then another. Between 1770 and 1857, there were at least 12 major famines in company-controlled territories. 12. That's not a natural pattern. India had famines before the company took over, but nowhere near this frequency or severity. So what changed? The change was that the economy was now run by an entity whose only goal was extraction. Let me explain how this worked, because the economic logic is crucial to understanding not just what the company did in the 18th and 19th centuries, but what corporations do today when they're given unchecked power. In a traditional pre-colonial economy, even one run by an emperor or king who was extractive, there were limits to extraction because the ruler had a long-term interest in the prosperity of the territory.
If you're a king and you overtax farmers so badly that they can't plant next year's crops, you've just reduced your future tax revenue. If you extract so much wealth that the economy collapses, you've destroyed your own tax base. So even a selfish king has incentives to not kill the goose that lays golden eggs. He wants to extract the maximum sustainable amount, not the maximum possible amount, because he's planning to be king for life and he wants his children to inherit a functioning kingdom. But a corporation, especially one with tradable shares and rotating management, doesn't have those incentives. The shareholders can sell their shares at any time. The directors and managers are appointed for limited terms. Nobody in the decision-making chain has a personal, long-term stake in the health of the territory being governed. What they have is a short-term incentive to maximize revenue this year, this quarter, this fiscal period, so that dividends go up, share prices increase, and they personally profit before moving on to the next opportunity. This is the structural difference between sovereign governance and corporate governance, and it explains why corporate rule was so much more destructive than even exploitative imperial rule.
The East India Company's tax policy in Bengal is a perfect example. After taking over tax collection in 1765, the company immediately increased rates. Then, when those rates caused economic distress and reduced the number of people who could pay, instead of lowering rates, the company raised them higher on the remaining taxpayers to make up the revenue shortfall. This is insane from a long-term governance perspective, but it makes perfect sense from a corporate quarterly earnings perspective. If revenue is falling, you don't report lower earnings to shareholders and watch your stock price drop. You find ways to maintain revenue by squeezing harder. So that's what they did. They squeezed harder. They expanded the tax base by taxing things that had never been taxed before. They increased enforcement, sending soldiers to collect taxes by force. They sold tax collection rights to private contractors who paid the company up front for the right to collect taxes in a district, and then those contractors squeezed the population even harder to make back their investment plus profit. This is called tax farming, and it's one of the most extractive systems ever devised because it puts a profit-seeking middleman between the government and the taxpayer, and that middleman has every incentive to extract maximum revenue with zero concern for the taxpayer's welfare. And when famines hit, which they inevitably did when you're extracting so much that farmers can't invest in irrigation, storage, or reserves, the company's response was to maintain tax collection and actually export food out of famine zones to sell in areas where prices were higher. Let me repeat that because it's important. During famines, while people were starving, the East India Company was exporting grain out of the famine-affected areas to sell where it would fetch better prices. This happened in the 1783 famine in South India. This happened in the 1791-92 famine in northern India. This happened repeatedly in the 19th century. And it wasn't because company officials were cartoon villains who enjoyed watching people starve. It was because the company's mandate was profit, and food exports were profitable, and there was no countervailing mechanism in the corporate structure that said maybe don't export food during a famine. In fact, stopping food exports would have reduced quarterly revenue, lowered dividends, and gotten the manager responsible for that decision fired for failing to maximize shareholder value. So the food was exported, millions starved, and the shareholders in London received their dividends on time. Now let me connect this directly to today because the pattern is identical just with different products. When pharmaceutical companies price insulin so high that diabetics die rationing it, that's the same logic. Insulin is necessary for life, but it's also profitable, so price it at what the market will bear, even if what the market will bear means some people die. When private equity firms buy hospitals, cut staffing to reduce costs, and patient care suffers, that's the same logic. Staffing is a cost, cutting costs increases profit, and the private equity investors will sell their stake in a few years so they don't care about long-term patient outcomes. When food companies engineer products to be maximally addictive, even though that causes obesity and health crises, same logic. Addiction increases consumption, consumption increases revenue, health consequences are externalized onto individuals and the public healthcare system. The corporate structure creates the same incentives today that it created in 1770s Bengal. Maximize short-term extraction, externalize costs, let someone else deal with the consequences. The East India Company was just more direct about it because they had military power and faced less public scrutiny.
Let's talk about what the company did to Indian industry, because this is one of the greatest economic crimes in history, and it perfectly demonstrates what happens when corporations control trade policy. In the early 1700s, India was the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. Indian textiles, particularly cotton cloth, were the finest available and were exported globally. European, African, and Asian markets all bought Indian textiles. The Mughal Empire's textile industry employed millions of weavers, spinners, dyers, and merchants. Indian cloth was so superior to European cloth that British textile manufacturers were losing market share in their own country to Indian imports. So what did the company do? They used their control over the British government to ban Indian textile imports to Britain. The Calico Acts of 1700 and 1721 prohibited the import of Indian cotton cloth. This protected British manufacturers from Indian competition, but the company still controlled India, so they did the opposite there. They forced Indian weavers to sell their cloth exclusively to the company at prices the company dictated. The weavers couldn't sell to anyone else. They couldn't negotiate prices. They had to take what the company offered or face punishment. And what the company offered was far below market rates. So here's the system. The company used its monopoly power in India to buy textiles at artificially low prices. They then shipped those textiles to other markets, not Britain because that was banned to protect British industry, and sold them at market rates. The company captured the entire profit margin. The Indian weavers were reduced to poverty wage laborers. And then, when the British Industrial Revolution created mechanized textile production in the early 1800s, the company shifted strategy again. Now, they didn't want to buy Indian textiles, they wanted to sell British textiles in India. So they flooded the Indian market with cheap, machine-made British cloth, which undercut the Indian handloom weavers who couldn't compete with industrialized production. The Indian textile industry, which had dominated global markets for centuries, collapsed. Millions of weavers lost their livelihoods, and India went from being the world's largest textile exporter to being an importer of British textiles and an exporter of raw cotton. The company had deliberately de-industrialized India to benefit British industry. This is economic colonialism in its purest form, and the parallel to modern globalization is exact. Western corporations move manufacturing to countries with cheap labor. They pay those workers as little as possible. They ship the products back to wealthy markets and sell them at high prices, capturing the profit margin. The workers who make the products can't afford to buy them, and if those workers try to organize for better wages, or if their governments try to protect local industries, the corporations threaten to move production elsewhere or lobby for trade agreements that prevent protectionism. It's the same model the East India Company used. Control the supply chain, dictate prices at every stage, prevent workers and producers from organizing or protecting themselves, capture maximum value. This isn't a distortion of corporate capitalism. This is corporate capitalism working as designed. The East India Company was just more honest about it because they didn't have to pretend to believe in free markets while actively rigging them.
Let me give you the numbers on wealth extraction because they're staggering and they put modern corporate profits in perspective. Economic historians estimate that between 1765 and 1938, Britain extracted approximately $45 trillion from India in today's dollars. $45 trillion. That's not total trade value, that's wealth extracted, meaning wealth that flowed out of India to Britain without fair compensation. And the majority of that extraction happened during the company period and the direct British rule that followed. Where did this wealth come from? Taxes that were collected in India and sent to Britain, trade surpluses where India was forced to export more than it imported and the difference was captured by British firms, destruction of Indian industry and replacement with British imports, and direct looting which continued well beyond the immediate post-Plassey period. This $45 trillion, extracted over 173 years, is why Britain became wealthy enough to industrialize, build an empire, and establish itself as a global power. And it's why India, which was one of the richest regions in the world in 1700, was one of the poorest by 1947 when it finally gained independence. The poverty wasn't natural. It wasn't due to overpopulation or backwardness or any inherent Indian failing. It was created by systematic extraction over centuries, and that extraction was pioneered and perfected by a corporation.
Now let me tell you about the opium trade, because this is where the company's corporate logic led to one of the most immoral schemes in economic history, and also because it demonstrates that corporations will literally traffic drugs and start wars to maintain profit margins. By the late 1700s, the company had a problem. They were buying massive amounts of tea from China to sell in Britain, where tea had become enormously popular. But the Chinese didn't want British goods. China was self-sufficient in most products and had little interest in wool, manufactured goods, or anything else Britain produced. So the company had to pay for tea in silver, which was draining British silver reserves. The trade deficit with China was becoming unsustainable from the company's perspective. They needed something the Chinese wanted that Britain could produce or that the company could supply. And they found it. Opium. Opium poppies grew well in Bengal. The company took over opium production, forced farmers to grow opium instead of food crops, and created a monopoly on opium processing and sale. Then they smuggled the opium into China, where it was illegal, sold it through private merchants to avoid direct company culpability, and used the silver they earned from opium sales to buy tea. Let me say that again because it's genuinely insane. The East India Company, a corporation chartered by the British government, created a state-run drug cartel in India, trafficked opium into China in violation of Chinese law, addicted millions of Chinese people to opium, and used the drug money to buy tea. And when the Chinese government tried to stop this, tried to enforce their own laws against drug smuggling, the British government sent the military to force China to accept the opium trade. This resulted in the Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, where the British military fought to preserve the East India Company's right to traffic drugs. Britain won both wars, forced China to legalize opium, and extracted treaty concessions, including the handover of Hong Kong.
This is what corporations do when they have state backing and no accountability. They will poison millions of people, violate other countries' laws, and use military force to protect profit streams. And the opium trade was hugely profitable. At its peak, opium accounted for about 15% of the company's revenue in India. That's 1/6 of their income coming from drug trafficking. And nobody in Britain saw a problem with this because it was enormously popular. Tea prices in Britain stayed low because the tea trade was subsidized by opium revenue. British consumers got cheap tea, British shareholders got dividends, and the human cost, millions of Chinese opium addicts and the destruction of Chinese sovereignty, was externalized. It happened far away, it happened to foreigners, and it was necessary for profit, so it was justified. Now think about modern pharmaceutical companies and the opioid crisis. Purdue Pharma and other companies aggressively marketed opioids, downplayed addiction risks, and created millions of addicts to maximize sales of pain medication. When the consequences became undeniable, hundreds of thousands dead from overdoses, the companies declared bankruptcy to avoid liability, and the families who owned the companies kept billions in profits. It's the same pattern. Create addiction to maximize revenue, externalize the costs onto individuals and society, avoid accountability through legal structures. The East India Company was trafficking opium in the 1800s, Purdue Pharma was trafficking opioids in the 2000s. The product changed, the basic corporate logic didn't. Find something people will become dependent on, maximize sales regardless of harm, and use legal structures to avoid consequences. Let me tell you about the company's army, because it's important to understand the scale of the military force that a corporation commanded. By the 1840s, the East India Company had an army of over 280,000 soldiers. To put that in perspective, the entire British Army at the time was about 140,000 soldiers. A corporation had an army twice the size of the British military. This army wasn't just for defense, it was used for continuous expansion. Throughout the late 1700s and early 1800s, the company fought wars against nearly every major Indian power, the Marathas, the Mysore Sultanate, the Sikh Empire, and dozens of smaller kingdoms. And these weren't minor skirmishes. These were major wars involving tens of thousands of soldiers, modern artillery, and prolonged campaigns. The company was waging imperial wars of conquest, and they were funding these wars through the tax revenue they extracted from the territories they'd already conquered. It was a self-reinforcing cycle. Conquer territory, extract taxes, use tax revenue to fund more conquest, conquer more territory, extract more taxes. And every conquest was justified to shareholders as necessary to protect existing company interests or to open new markets. The human cost of these wars was immense. The Anglo-Mysore Wars between 1767 and 1799 killed hundreds of thousands. The Anglo-Maratha Wars in the early 1800s devastated central India. The Anglo-Sikh Wars in the 1840s conquered the last major independent Indian power. And in every case, the company's motivation was commercial. These weren't wars to spread civilization or Christianity, though those justifications were used for public consumption. These were wars to eliminate competition, control trade routes, and expand the tax base. Corporate expansion through military force. And the soldiers doing the fighting were mostly Indian sepoys, Indian soldiers employed by the company and commanded by British officers. So the company was using Indians to conquer other Indians, paying them with tax revenue extracted from Indians to enrich British shareholders. The audacity of this system is breathtaking.
And this brings us to the crisis, the moment when the contradictions of corporate rule became so extreme that the entire system exploded. In 1857, the Indian soldiers of the company's army rebelled. It started over a rumor that the new rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, which would be offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers who had to bite the cartridges to load them. But the cartridge issue was just the spark. The real causes were decades of accumulated grievances. The company had been annexing kingdoms using a policy called the Doctrine of Lapse, which said that if an Indian ruler died without a direct heir, the company could take over the kingdom instead of allowing adoption or succession by relatives. This was a blatant land grab that violated Indian customs and traditions. The company had been interfering with religious practices, taxing temple lands, and allowing Christian missionaries to operate more freely, which created fears of forced conversion. The company's extractive tax policies had impoverished huge sections of the population. And the Indian soldiers, the sepoys, had seen their pay stagnate, their opportunities for promotion limited by racism, and their British officers treat them with increasing contempt. All of this created a situation where a large portion of the company's own army was ready to turn against it. The rebellion, which the British called the Sepoy Mutiny and which Indians called the First War of Independence, spread rapidly across northern India in 1857. Entire regiments of the company's army mutinied. They killed British officers, seized weapons, and marched on Delhi, where they proclaimed the Mughal emperor, who was by this point a powerless figurehead, as the leader of a restored Indian empire. The rebellion was joined by dispossessed princes, unemployed soldiers from kingdoms the company had annexed, and ordinary people who had suffered under company rule. For several months, it looked like the company might actually lose control of India. Major cities fell to the rebels, British civilians were killed, and there were atrocities on both sides. But the company still controlled most of southern and eastern India, and they brought in British troops from other colonies and eventually crushed the rebellion with extreme violence. The retribution was savage. Entire villages suspected of supporting the rebellion were burned. Captured rebels were executed by being tied to cannons and blown apart, a deliberate choice to maximize terror. Thousands were hanged. The company's response to rebellion was to demonstrate that resistance would be met with overwhelming, brutal force. But the rebellion broke something. The British government and the British public, who had largely ignored what the company was doing in India as long as dividends kept flowing, suddenly had to confront the fact that corporate rule had created so much resentment that hundreds of thousands of people were willing to risk their lives to overthrow it. The company's legitimacy was gone. Its military had proven unreliable, and its governance had created the conditions for massive instability. So, in 1858, the British government passed the Government of India Act, which dissolved the East India Company and transferred control of India to the British Crown. After 258 years, the company was over. The corporate state was replaced by direct imperial rule. But here's what's crucial. The British government didn't end the company because corporate rule was morally wrong or economically destructive to India. They ended it because it had become politically unstable and therefore risky for British interests. And they didn't reverse the company's policies. They continued them.
The tax extraction continued, the deindustrialization continued, the famines continued. There were massive famines in the 1870s and 1890s under direct British rule that killed millions more. The wealth drain continued. The only thing that changed was who was in charge. Instead of being run by a corporation accountable to shareholders, India was now run by an empire accountable to no one. The people of India didn't gain freedom or justice. They just got a different form of extraction. And the company itself was dissolved, but its shareholders were compensated. The British government paid them off. So even in death, the company took care of its investors.
And this is the pattern we need to understand. Corporations extract until they create crisis. The crisis forces government intervention, but the intervention doesn't dismantle the system, it stabilizes it and allows extraction to continue under new management. The East India Company collapsed and was replaced by the British Raj. Banks collapsed in 2008 and were bailed out, and the same executives kept running them. Coal companies go bankrupt from lawsuits over black lung disease and reform under new names. Pharmaceutical companies pay fines for illegal marketing and continue operating. The corporation dies, or appears to die, but the system survives, and the people who profited walk away with their wealth intact while the victims get nothing. Let me end this chapter by asking you to imagine what it was like to live under corporate rule. Imagine you're a farmer in Bengal in 1800. Your family has farmed this land for generations, but now the land is owned by the company, technically, or by a company-approved landlord. You have to grow what the company tells you to grow. If they want indigo for dye, you grow indigo instead of food, even though indigo depletes the soil. You have to sell your crop to company agents at prices they dictate. You have no bargaining power because the company is the only buyer. The taxes you pay are set by the company to maximize revenue, not based on what you can afford. If you can't pay, company soldiers come to your village and seize your property or arrest you. There's no court you can appeal to because the company runs the courts. There's no representative you can complain to because the company isn't elected. There's no alternative economy you can participate in because the company controls trade. You are trapped in a system designed to extract maximum value from your labor while giving you the minimum necessary to survive, and sometimes not even that. And if you resist, if you refuse to pay taxes, or refuse to grow what you're told, or join a rebellion, you will be killed. That is corporate rule. That is what happens when profit motive becomes the organizing principle of government. And the terrifying thing is that we're moving back toward that model in some ways. Corporations already control massive aspects of our lives. They control healthcare through private insurance companies that decide what treatments you can get. They control information through social media platforms that decide what you see. They control infrastructure through private equity ownership of utilities, roads, and even prisons. They control democracy through lobbying and campaign finance. We don't live under corporate rule the way Indians did in 1800, but the trajectory is concerning. As governments shrink and corporations grow, as public services are privatized and regulation is weakened, as corporate power becomes more concentrated and corporations become more politically influential, we move incrementally toward a system where corporations make the rules and the rest of us just live under them. And the East India Company shows us where that ends. It ends with extraction, impoverishment, famine, and violence, because that's what corporations do when they're given unchecked power. Not because the people running them are evil, but because the structure incentivizes extraction and prevents accountability. So now we've seen the conquest, the rule, and the collapse of the corporate state. In Chapter 4, we're going to trace what happened to the company's model after 1858. Because even though the East India Company was dissolved, the corporate form survived and spread. The limited liability corporation became the standard business structure across the world. The techniques the company pioneered, lobbying, monopoly, regulatory capture, stock manipulation, using state violence for private profit, all of that became normalized.
and the wealth the company extracted from India helped fund Britain's Industrial Revolution, which created new corporations that used the same playbook in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and eventually everywhere. The company died, but it had children, lots of them, and those children grew up to run the world. That's Chapter 4, the legacy, the inheritance, the corporate DNA that's still replicating today.
So the East India Company is dissolved in 1858. The British government takes over India directly. The corporation is dead. Problem solved, right? The experiment in corporate rule failed. Everyone learned their lesson, and we moved on to better systems. Except that's not what happened at all. What happened was that the East India Company became the most successful business model in history, not despite its brutality, but because of its profitability. Every technique the company pioneered, every structural innovation, every method of extraction and control was studied, copied, and refined by the corporations that came after. The East India Company didn't fail. It succeeded so spectacularly that it became the template for corporate capitalism worldwide. And if you want to understand why corporations behave the way they do today, why they lobby governments, pursue monopolies, externalize costs, and avoid accountability, you need to understand that they're not deviating from some pure ideal of capitalism. They're following the blueprint. The East India Company wrote that blueprint in blood and profit over 258 years, and modern corporations have been following it ever since. So this chapter is about inheritance, about how the DNA of the company, its structure, its methods, its logic, spread from India across the entire world, about how American robber barons copied the playbook in the late 1800s, about how United Fruit recreated the company's model in Latin America in the early 1900s, about how oil companies used the same techniques in the Middle East, and about how today's tech giants, pharmaceutical companies, and private equity firms are doing exactly what the East India Company did, just with different products and more sophisticated public relations. This isn't ancient history. This is the origin story of the present. Let's start with what the British government did after taking over India from the company, because the transition reveals something important about how extraction works. When the government dissolved the company and assumed direct control, did they reverse the company's policies? Did they lower taxes, reinvest in Indian industry, or stop the wealth drain? No, they continued exactly as the company had been doing, but now under the crown instead of under corporate shareholders. The extraction of wealth from India to Britain continued, the deindustrialization continued, the tax policies continued, and the famines continued. In fact, some of the worst famines in Indian history happened under direct British rule, not under the company. The Great Famine of 1876 to 1878 killed between 5 and 10 million people. The Indian Famine of 1896 to 1997 killed another 5 million. The Bengal Famine of 1943, yes, another one, killed 3 million. And in every case, British authorities followed the same logic the company had followed: maintain tax revenue, allow food exports, and blame the victims. The difference was that now it wasn't a corporation doing this, it was a government, but the system was the same, the incentives were the same. Britain needed India's wealth to fund its empire and its industrial economy, so the extraction continued regardless of who was technically in charge. This tells us something crucial. The problem wasn't just that the East India Company was a corporation. The problem was the extractive system the company had built, and once that system was in place, it became self-perpetuating because it served powerful interests. British textile manufacturers needed Indian markets. British banks needed Indian investments. The British government needed Indian tax revenue. British consumers wanted cheap tea, sugar, and cotton. The entire British economy had become dependent on extraction from India, so even when the mechanism changed from corporate to imperial, the extraction continued. This is the pattern we see over and over. An extractive system gets established, it creates beneficiaries who have power, and those beneficiaries maintain the system even when the original entity that created it is gone. The East India Company dissolved, but the system it built outlived it by nearly a century until Indian independence in 1947. And even after independence, the economic structures took decades to dismantle, and some effects persist to this day.
But while the British were running
India directly, the corporate model the East India Company had pioneered was spreading to other places. And the first major inheritors of the East India Company's DNA were the American robber barons of the late 1800s. These were men like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, who built massive corporate empires in oil, steel, banking, and railroads. And if you study what they did, you see the East India Company playbook being followed with precision. Rockefeller and Standard Oil are the clearest example. So let's walk through how he built his empire, because every step mirrors what the East India Company did. Rockefeller started in the oil refining business in the 1860s, just one small refinery among many. But he had ambitions for monopoly, not just success, but total domination of the industry. So he started buying up competitors. If a rival refinery wouldn't sell, he'd use predatory pricing, temporarily dropping his prices below cost to drive them out of business, and then buying their assets when they went bankrupt. This is exactly what the East India Company did to Indian weavers and rival European traders. Once Rockefeller controlled most of the refining capacity, he went after the transportation networks. He made secret deals with railroads to get massive rebates on shipping costs, and not just rebates on his own shipments, but he got paid a percentage of what his competitors paid to ship their oil. Read that again. Rockefeller made deals where railroads gave him money based on how much his competitors were shipping. This gave him a cost advantage that was impossible to overcome. If you were a rival refinery, you were literally funding Rockefeller's competitive advantage with every barrel you shipped. Within a decade, Rockefeller controlled about 90% of oil refining in the United States. He'd created a monopoly through a combination of efficiency, yes, but also through predatory practices, secret deals, and using his market power to rig the system. This is the East India Company model. Use monopoly power to dictate terms, make secret deals with the entities that control critical infrastructure, and eliminate competition by any means necessary. And Rockefeller used the same corporate structure the East India Company had pioneered, the trust. He created the Standard Oil Trust in 1882, which was a legal innovation that allowed him to control hundreds of separate companies under one centralized management while limiting liability. If one subsidiary did something illegal or caused harm, the others were theoretically protected. This is the same limited liability structure the East India Company had used. It allowed Rockefeller to take risks, engage in practices that might be legally questionable, and avoid personal accountability. The trust was so effective at concentrating power and avoiding responsibility that it was eventually outlawed. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was passed specifically to break up monopolies like Standard Oil. But by the time the Supreme Court ordered Standard Oil broken up in 1911, Rockefeller was already the richest man in history, and the trust was dissolved into smaller companies that Rockefeller still largely controlled. He won. Just like the East India Company, he built a monopoly, extracted enormous wealth, faced legal consequences only after decades of dominance, and walked away rich, while the system he built continued in modified form.
Carnegie did the same thing in steel. He vertically integrated, buying not just steel mills, but also the iron mines, the coal mines, the railroads that transported ore, and the ships that carried finished steel. He controlled every step of production, which gave him cost advantages no competitor could match. And when workers tried to organize for better wages, Carnegie used violence to break strikes. The Homestead Strike of 1892 saw Carnegie's company hire private security forces, literally a private army called the Pinkertons, to attack striking workers. People died. This is corporate violence, the same kind the East India Company used, just in Pennsylvania instead of Bengal. And Carnegie, like the East India Company directors, claimed he wasn't responsible. He was in Scotland during the strike. His managers made the decisions. He was just a shareholder, technically. The diffusion of responsibility built into corporate structure allowed him to avoid accountability for violence done in his company's name. J.P. Morgan did it in banking and railroads. He consolidated railroads to eliminate wasteful competition, which is a nice way of saying he created monopolies and cartels that could charge whatever they wanted.
He bailed out the U.S. government during financial crises in 1895 and 1907, which gave him enormous influence over government policy. He became too important to regulate. This is regulatory capture, the same thing the East India Company achieved when it became so critical to British finances that the government couldn't afford to restrict it. By the early 1900s, Morgan controlled so much of the American economy through direct ownership and through interlocking directorates where the same people sat on boards of competing companies that he effectively decided interest rates, railroad rates, and industrial policy. A private banker had more economic power than the elected government. And this was all legal. This was celebrated as business genius. The parallels to the East India Company are exact. These men built monopolies through combination of innovation and ruthless elimination of competition. They used corporate structures to limit liability and avoid accountability. They achieved regulatory capture by becoming too important to fail. They used violence or the threat of violence against workers and competitors. They made secret deals with transportation networks and governments. They extracted enormous wealth and concentrated it in their own hands. And they justified all of this as economic efficiency and natural selection. Social Darwinism was the ideology of the robber baron era, the idea that the strong deserved to dominate the weak, which is just a rebranding of the civilizing mission rhetoric the East India Company used. The language changed, the underlying logic didn't. And just like with the East India Company, there was eventually a backlash. The progressive era of the early 1900s saw trust busting, antitrust enforcement, labor regulations, and attempts to rein in corporate power. Teddy Roosevelt made his reputation breaking up monopolies. Laws were passed to limit corporate abuses. This is the equivalent of the British government's eventual intervention in the East India Company. But notice the pattern. Corporations build power, extract wealth, and abuse that power for decades before any meaningful regulation happens. And when regulation does happen, it limits the most extreme abuses, but preserves the fundamental corporate structure and allows wealth to remain concentrated. Standard Oil was broken up, but Rockefeller stayed rich. Carnegie sold his steel company and became a philanthropist, using the money he'd extracted through brutal labor practices to build libraries and universities, which burnished his reputation. J.P. Morgan died before serious regulation could touch him. The robber barons won. They lived lives of luxury, kept their wealth, and are now remembered as industrial pioneers. The workers who died in their factories and the competitors they destroyed are forgotten.
Now let's jump to a different context, but the same pattern. United Fruit Company in Latin America in the early 1900s. If you want to see the East India Company model exported wholesale to a different continent, this is it. United Fruit was founded in 1899 to grow and export bananas from Central America to the United States. Bananas were a luxury product that was becoming popular in the U.S., and United Fruit saw an opportunity to dominate the trade. So they bought vast plantations in Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, and Colombia. But they didn't just buy plantations, they bought railroads to move the bananas. They bought ports to ship them. They bought steamship lines to transport them. They bought telephone and telegraph companies to coordinate operations. They became the largest landowner and employer in multiple countries. And then they started acting like the East India Company had in India. They used their economic power to control governments. In Guatemala, United Fruit owned so much land and employed so many people that they were effectively more powerful than the Guatemalan government. They paid almost no taxes because they'd negotiated sweetheart deals with compliant governments. They controlled the only railroad so they could dictate shipping rates. They controlled the ports so they controlled exports. If the Guatemalan government tried to regulate them, United Fruit would threaten to pull out, which would collapse the economy. And if threats didn't work, United Fruit would lobby the U.S. government to intervene. And the U.S. government, where United Fruit had deep connections, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had been on United Fruit's board, would oblige. In 1954, when Guatemala elected a president, Jacobo Arbenz, who wanted to implement land reform and reclaim some of the vast unused land United Fruit was holding, the CIA organized a coup. They overthrew a democratically elected government to protect a banana company's property. This is the East India Company playbook perfectly executed. Economic dominance leads to political control leads to favorable regulations, and any threat to profits leads to government violence. The term banana republic was coined to describe countries dominated by United Fruit. It means a country where the government is subservient to corporate interests, where the economy is based on exporting one or two commodities, where wealth is concentrated in a tiny elite, and where the population is kept poor and powerless. This is exactly what the East India Company created in India. United Fruit created the same system in Central America. They kept wages as low as possible, they prevented workers from organizing, they worked with dictators who would suppress labor movements, they extracted profits and sent them back to American shareholders. And the countries where they operated remained poor, underdeveloped, and politically unstable for decades. Guatemala is still dealing with the consequences of United Fruit's dominance and the 1954 coup, which led to a civil war that lasted until 1996 and killed over 200,000 people. All of that traces back to a corporation protecting its profits. And United Fruit wasn't unique. The same pattern was repeating across Latin America, Africa, and Asia with different corporations in different products. Mining companies in the Congo, rubber plantations in the Dutch East Indies, oil companies in Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. Let's focus on oil because it's the clearest modern continuation of the East India Company model and because it connects directly to events you've lived through. In the early 1900s, oil was discovered in the Middle East. Iran, then called Persia, had massive reserves. Iraq had massive reserves. Saudi Arabia had massive reserves. And Western oil companies, British Petroleum, which started as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and American companies like Standard Oil's successors, moved in to exploit these reserves. And they used the exact same model the East India Company had used. Negotiate extraction rights with weak or compliant governments, pay as little as possible in royalties, control the infrastructure, and use political influence to maintain favorable terms.
The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which became British Petroleum or BP, made a deal with the Iranian government in 1901 that gave them exclusive rights to Iranian oil for 60 years in exchange for a small percentage of profits. The Iranian government got about 16% of profits. The company got 84%, and the company controlled the accounting so they could manipulate what counted as profit. This is the same deal structure the East India Company used with Indian weavers. We'll buy your product, we'll set the price, and you'll take what we give you. And it worked brilliantly for BP. They extracted billions in value from Iranian oil. They paid minimal royalties. They controlled Iran's most valuable resource. But here's what happened when Iran tried to change the terms. In 1951, Iran elected a prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who wanted to nationalize the oil industry. He argued that Iranian oil should benefit Iranians, not British shareholders. Seems reasonable. Iran's oil, Iran's decision. But BP lobbied the British government. The British imposed sanctions, and when Mossadegh wouldn't back down, the British and Americans organized a coup in 1953, overthrew Mossadegh, and installed the Shah, a dictator who was friendly to Western oil interests. Does this sound familiar? It should. It's the same thing the East India Company did when the Nawab of Bengal tried to assert authority in 1756. It's the same thing United Fruit did in Guatemala in 1954. It's the same thing corporations have done over and over. When a government threatens corporate profits, lobby your home government to intervene. And if lobbying doesn't work, support a coup. The Iranian coup had consequences that we're still living with today. The Shah was overthrown in 1979 in the Iranian Revolution, which brought to power an anti-Western Islamic regime. U.S.-Iran relations have been hostile ever since. The entire geopolitical situation in the Middle East traces back, in part, to a 1953 coup done to protect oil company profits. Corporate decisions made 70 years ago are still shaping wars and politics today. And this pattern repeated across the Middle East. In Iraq, British and American oil companies controlled oil extraction under similar unfair terms. When Iraq nationalized oil in the 1970s, Western powers tried to undermine the government. In Saudi Arabia, Aramco, originally a consortium of American oil companies, had a sweetheart deal with the Saudi monarchy, and the U.S. government protected that monarchy militarily in exchange for oil access. The entire structure of the modern Middle East, the borders, the regimes, the conflicts, was shaped by oil companies pursuing the same logic the East India Company followed. Control resources, keep governments compliant, use your home government's military when necessary, and extract maximum profit. And the human cost? Coups, wars, dictatorships, millions dead, entire regions destabilized. But the shareholders got their returns, so from a corporate perspective, success. Now, let's bring this to the present, because I need you to see that this isn't history. This is ongoing. Modern corporations use the exact same techniques the East India Company pioneered. They're just more subtle about it because we have more regulations and more public scrutiny. But the DNA is the same. Let's start with tech companies, because they're the most powerful corporations right now, and because they demonstrate every element of the East India Company playbook. Amazon, Google, Facebook, now Meta, Apple, and Microsoft are collectively worth over $10 trillion. That's more than the GDP of every country except the US and China. They have user bases in the billions. They control infrastructure that modern life depends on. And they got there using techniques the East India Company would recognize immediately.
Start with monopoly. Amazon dominates e-commerce with about 40% of the US market. But more importantly, they control the infrastructure. They run the largest cloud computing service, AWS, which hosts huge portions of the internet. They own the logistics network, they own Whole Foods, they're moving into healthcare, pharmacies, and entertainment. This is vertical integration, the same strategy Carnegie used and the East India Company used. Control every layer of the value chain so competitors can't get a foothold. And Amazon uses its platform power the same way the East India Company used its monopoly. They see what third-party sellers are successfully selling on Amazon's marketplace, then Amazon creates their own version of the product, prices it lower because they don't have to pay Amazon's fees, and promotes their version in search results. This is using monopoly power to eliminate competition. It's predatory. It's exactly what Rockefeller did with oil refineries. And it's legal. Barely, because antitrust enforcement has been weakened over the past 40 years. Google controls 92% of global search. They control the infrastructure of information. If you want to be found online, you need to be in Google's search results. If you want to advertise online, you probably use Google's ad platform. They control Android, the operating system on most smartphones. They control YouTube. This is infrastructure monopoly, and Google uses that monopoly to favor their own services, to collect data on everyone, and to make competition nearly impossible. If you try to build a search engine to compete with Google, you're starting so far behind in data, algorithms, and infrastructure that you'll never catch up. The monopoly is self-reinforcing. This is the same position the East India Company had in the 1700s in India. They controlled the infrastructure of trade, so if you wanted to do business, you had to go through them. Facebook, or Meta, doesn't just dominate social media. They bought their competitors. Instagram was becoming a threat, so Facebook bought it. WhatsApp was becoming huge, so Facebook bought it. Oculus was leading in VR, so Facebook bought it. This is the same strategy the East India Company used. Eliminate competition through acquisition, or if they won't sell, through predatory practices. When Snapchat refused to sell to Facebook, Facebook copied their features and used their larger user base to crush Snapchat's growth. And Facebook uses surveillance capitalism, collecting massive amounts of data on users and selling that data, or access to users based on that data, to advertisers. This is extraction. You're the product. Your data, your attention, your psychology is being harvested and sold. You get the service for free, but you're paying with your privacy, your mental health, and your agency. This is the same extractive model the East India Company used. Create a system where people have no choice but to participate, then extract value from their participation.
And these tech companies use political influence the same way the East India Company did. They spend hundreds of millions on lobbying. They hire former government officials to manage their regulatory affairs. They threaten to move operations or withhold investment if governments regulate them. Australia tried to make Facebook pay news organizations for content. Facebook responded by blocking all news in Australia until the government modified the law.
That's a corporation threatening a sovereign government and winning. When the EU tries to regulate data privacy or antitrust, tech companies lobby intensely, sue, and drag out enforcement for years. This is regulatory capture and political influence that the East India Company pioneered, and it works. Despite having monopoly power, despite privacy violations, despite algorithmic harm, despite election interference, these companies remain largely unregulated and continue to grow. Now let's talk about private equity, because it's the purest modern descendant of East India Company extraction logic. Private equity firms buy companies using massive amounts of borrowed money. They load the debt onto the company they just bought, they extract as much cash as possible through dividends and fees to themselves, and then, often, they let the company go bankrupt, leaving workers, vendors, and the community holding the bag while the private equity firm walks away with profits. This is extraction without any pretense of building or operating a sustainable business. Let me give you a specific example. Toys R Us. In 2005, private equity firms bought Toys R Us for $6.6 billion, mostly with borrowed money. They loaded $5 billion of debt onto Toys R Us. Then they charged Toys R Us hundreds of millions in management fees. They extracted cash, they sold off real estate, and the debt burden was so heavy that Toys R Us couldn't invest in modernizing stores or competing with Amazon. In 2017, Toys R Us went bankrupt. 33,000 workers lost their jobs, but the private equity firms had already extracted over $470 million in fees. They made money even though the company died. This happened with Sears, with Radio Shack, with dozens of retail chains, nursing homes, and hospitals. Private equity buys them, loads them with debt, extracts cash, and lets them die. And this is legal. This is celebrated as financial engineering. But it's the same thing the East India Company did in Bengal: extract as much as possible, as quickly as possible, without concern for long-term sustainability, because the people making the decisions don't suffer the consequences. The private equity partners are compensated based on short-term returns. They sell their stake and move on. The workers lose their jobs, the communities lose anchor businesses, the vendors don't get paid. But the private equity firm made money, so from their perspective, success. And when private equity buys nursing homes, which they increasingly do, they cut staff to reduce costs, which leads to worse patient care and more deaths. Studies have shown that private equity ownership of nursing homes increases patient mortality. People die so that investors can make slightly higher returns. This is the famine logic of the East India Company: maintain revenue extraction even when it kills people. And here's the thing that should terrify you. Private equity now controls over $7 trillion in assets globally. They own huge portions of healthcare, real estate, infrastructure, retail, and media. They're buying everything, and their model is extraction. They don't build, they don't create long-term value, they extract and move on. It's corporate raiding at a civilization-wide scale, and it's working because the regulatory environment allows it, because limited liability protects investors, because the complexity of financial structures obscures responsibility, and because short-term profits are rewarded over long-term sustainability. All of these are features the East India Company pioneered.
So let me connect all of this. The East India Company was dissolved in 1858. But every technique they invented, every structure they created, every method of extraction and control was copied and refined by the corporations that came after. American robber barons used monopoly and vertical integration. United Fruit used economic dominance to control governments. Oil companies used political influence and supported coups. Tech companies used platform monopolies and data extraction. Private equity uses financial engineering to extract wealth and externalize losses. The products changed, the geographies changed, the specific tactics evolved, but the underlying DNA is identical. Pursue monopoly, eliminate competition, capture regulators, externalize costs, and avoid accountability through corporate structure. This isn't a bug in capitalism. This is capitalism working as designed. The design was written by the East India Company. Every corporation since has been following the blueprint.
And the wealth concentration this creates is staggering. In 1700, before the East India Company really took control of India, global wealth was relatively distributed. China and India were the richest regions. By 1950, after 250 years of corporate and imperial extraction, Western Europe and the United States held the vast majority of global wealth. Today, global wealth inequality is at levels not seen since the Gilded Age. The richest 1% own more wealth than the bottom 50% of humanity. 3 men, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett, had more wealth than the bottom 50% of Americans. That level of concentration is the direct result of extractive systems that have been running since the East India Company pioneered them. And those systems are accelerating. Wealth is concentrating faster now than at any point in history because corporations are more powerful, more global, and less regulated than ever. And this brings us to the question we've been building toward through all 4 chapters. What do we do about this? We've traced the origins of corporate capitalism to the East India Company. We've seen how a corporation conquered a subcontinent and ruled it for profit. We've seen the famines, the extraction, the violence, and the collapse. We've seen how the model spread to robber barons, to United Fruit, to oil companies, to tech giants, to private equity. We've seen the same patterns repeat over and over: monopoly, extraction, regulatory capture, externalized costs, and avoidance of accountability. And we've seen that the people who run these systems walk away rich, while the people harmed are blamed, forgotten, or left to die. So what do we do? Do we accept that this is just how capitalism works and there's nothing to be done? Do we try to reform corporations through regulation even though they capture the regulators? Do we try to replace corporate capitalism with something else? And if so, what? These are the questions Chapter 5 has to confront, and I don't have perfect answers. Nobody does. But we have history. We have examples of what's been tried. We have some things that worked and some things that failed. And we have a choice about what kind of world we want to live in and what we're willing to do to create it. So that's where we're going. The final chapter, not about history, but about now, about what the East India Company's legacy means for us, about what we've inherited and whether we're going to keep accepting it or whether we're going to build something different, about the deeper problem I mentioned at the very beginning. Do we accept that corporations are more powerful than governments? Do we accept that profit maximization is the highest good? Do we accept extraction, exploitation, and inequality as inevitable? Or do we recognize that these are choices, that systems built by humans can be changed by humans, and that the world doesn't have to be organized around making shareholders rich at everyone else's expense? That's the choice, and Chapter 5 is about confronting it honestly, without easy answers, but with the knowledge that we have to try, because the alternative is just watching the same patterns repeat forever, watching corporations grow more powerful, watching inequality widen, watching crises multiply, and pretending there's nothing we can do about it. And I don't accept that. I don't think you do either. So let's finish this. One more chapter, the hardest one, the one about what we do now. So here we are. 5 chapters in. You've spent nearly 2 hours with me tracing the history of corporate capitalism from a royal charter signed in 1600 to the tech monopolies and private equity firms of today. You understand now that corporations aren't just businesses that got efficient. They're power structures designed from the beginning to concentrate wealth, avoid accountability, and pursue profit by any means necessary, including violence. You've seen how the East India Company conquered India, caused famines that killed millions, extracted $45 trillion in wealth, and ruled 200 million people for corporate profit. You've seen how that model spread to American robber barons, to United Fruit in Latin America, to oil companies in the Middle East, and to every modern corporation that dominates our economy today. You've seen the pattern repeat over and over: monopoly, extraction, regulatory capture, externalized costs, and impunity for those who profit. And now you're probably thinking, okay, I get it. The system is broken and has been broken from the beginning. But what the hell do I do about it? And that's the question this chapter has to answer. Not with easy solutions or inspiring platitudes, because I don't have those and anyone who offers them is lying, but with honesty about what's been tried, what's worked, what's failed, and what the actual choices are, because we do have choices. The system was built by humans, which means it can be changed by humans. but change requires understanding what we're up against, what leverage we have, and what we're willing to sacrifice. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what happens when people who understand how corporations actually work try to fight back. And let's confront the deeper question I've been circling since the beginning. Do we accept a world where corporations are more powerful than governments, where profit is sacred and human life is expendable, where the systems that created the East India Company are still running today? Or do we decide that's unacceptable and commit to building something different, even if we don't know exactly what that looks like yet? Let me start with what's been tried historically, because we're not the first generation to recognize that corporate power is dangerous and needs limits. People figured this out while the East India Company was still operating. Adam Smith, the father of free market economics, the guy everyone quotes to defend capitalism, wrote in The Wealth of Nations in 1776 that joint stock companies like the East India Company were prone to corruption, inefficiency, and abuse because the people running them weren't using their own money and therefore had no incentive to act responsibly. He was skeptical of corporations. He thought they should only be allowed for specific purposes like building canals or infrastructure, not for general commerce. The idea that Adam Smith would support modern corporate capitalism is historical revisionism. He saw the problems with the model even as it was being invented. And in the 1800s, as corporations grew more powerful during the Industrial Revolution, there were massive movements to restrict them. Laborers organized unions. Socialists and communists argued for replacing capitalism entirely. Progressives pushed for regulation, and some of these efforts worked, at least partially and temporarily. The late 1800s and early 1900s saw serious antitrust enforcement in the United States. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was passed specifically to break up monopolies like Standard Oil, and it worked, sort of. Standard Oil was broken up in 1911 into 34 separate companies, but those companies remained huge and many of them eventually re-merged or consolidated into the oil giants we have today, like ExxonMobil and Chevron. So the breakup was real, but the long-term effect was limited. Same with AT&T, which was broken up in 1984 into regional phone companies, the Baby Bells, which then consolidated back into a few major telecom companies. Antitrust enforcement can work to break up monopolies in the moment, but unless you maintain that enforcement continuously and prevent reconsolidation, the monopolies just reform under new names. And that's what happened. From the 1980s onward, antitrust enforcement weakened dramatically. The legal standard shifted from, is this company too powerful, to does this harm consumers through higher prices? And if a monopoly could argue that they were keeping prices low, even if they were crushing competition and accumulating dangerous amounts of power, they were allowed to merge and grow. This is why we have Amazon, Google, Facebook, and a handful of companies controlling entire sectors of the economy today. Antitrust law still exists, but it's not enforced in any meaningful way.
The labor movement won real victories in the early to mid-1900s. Workers organized unions, fought for and won the 8-hour workday, weekends, workplace safety regulations, minimum wage, and the right to collective bargaining. These weren't gifts from benevolent corporations. These were hard-fought battles where workers went on strike, got beaten by corporate security forces and police, and sometimes died. The 1914 Ludlow Massacre saw Rockefeller's company hire gunmen to attack striking miners and their families, killing dozens, including children. The 1937 Memorial Day Massacre saw police kill 10 striking steelworkers. Labor victories came through solidarity, sacrifice, and forcing the government to choose between workers and corporations. And for a while, from roughly the 1930s to the 1970s, labor had enough power to balance corporate power. Union membership peaked at about 35% of American workers in the 1950s. Wages rose along with productivity. The middle class expanded. This is the period people are nostalgic for, the post-war boom where a single income could support a family. But that wasn't natural. That was the result of strong unions and regulations that forced corporations to share profits with workers.
But then, starting in the 1970s and accelerating in the 1980s, corporations fought back. They lobbied for laws that made union organizing harder. They moved manufacturing to non-union states and then to countries with no labor protections. They hired union-busting consultants. They used automation to replace workers. They classified workers as independent contractors to avoid providing benefits. And it worked. Union membership in the U.S. is now about 10% of workers, and even lower in the private sector. And as union power declined, the wage productivity gap opened up. Productivity kept rising, workers produced more value, but wages stagnated while profits went to shareholders. The graph of this divergence is stark. From 1948 to 1973, productivity and wages rose together. After 1973, productivity kept rising, but wages flatlined. That gap, that's extraction. That's workers creating value that's captured by capital instead of being shared. And it happened because workers lost the organizational power to demand their share. The New Deal in the 1930s created regulations that restrained corporate power. Banking regulations separated commercial banking from investment banking, so banks couldn't gamble with depositors' money. Securities regulations tried to prevent stock manipulation and fraud. Environmental regulations in the 1970s limited pollution and forced corporations to internalize some environmental costs. Consumer protection regulations made corporations liable for dangerous products. These regulations worked. Imperfectly, but meaningfully. They prevented some of the worst abuses. But corporations spent decades lobbying to weaken them. The Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial and investment banking, was repealed in 1999. Within a decade, the 2008 financial crisis happened because banks were once again gambling with depositors' money. Environmental regulations are constantly under attack and weakly enforced. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, created after 2008 to protect consumers from predatory lending, has been systematically weakened. Every regulation that restrains corporate profit is fought intensely by corporate lobbying, and over time, many are eliminated or weakened.
So, regulation can work, but only if it's continuously fought for and defended, and corporations have more resources to fight against regulation than citizens have to fight for it. Corporations spend billions on lobbying. They hire former regulators to work for them, creating revolving doors between industry and government. They fund think tanks that produce studies saying regulation is bad for the economy. They fund political campaigns for candidates who will deregulate. They threaten to move jobs or operations if regulations are too strict. This is regulatory capture, the same thing the East India Company achieved in the 1700s when it became so powerful that Parliament couldn't regulate it without damaging British economic interests. We're in a similar position now. Corporations are so large and so economically important that governments are afraid to regulate them too strictly for fear of economic disruption, and that fear gives corporations veto power over regulation. What about alternatives to corporate capitalism? Have those been tried? Yes, and the results are mixed and controversial. The Soviet Union tried replacing capitalism with state ownership and central planning. It failed spectacularly, collapsing in 1991 after 7 decades of authoritarianism, economic inefficiency, and inability to innovate. But the Soviet failure doesn't mean all alternatives to capitalism are doomed. It means that particular model, authoritarian central planning, doesn't work. Other models have had more success. The Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, have strong capitalist economies, but with much higher taxes, stronger unions, more regulation, and more robust social safety nets than the U.S. They're not socialist in the sense of state ownership of production, but they've managed to balance corporate power with worker power and state power in ways that produce less inequality and better social outcomes. Life expectancy is higher, poverty is lower, happiness indices are higher, education and healthcare are universal. So clearly it's possible to have capitalism with much stronger constraints than the US model. The question is whether that's politically achievable in countries where corporations already have massive power and fight any move toward the Nordic model. Worker cooperatives are another alternative. Instead of corporations owned by shareholders and run for profit, cooperatives are owned by the workers who run them democratically. Profits are shared among workers instead of extracted by shareholders. The Mondragon Corporation in Spain is a network of worker cooperatives employing tens of thousands of people. It's been successful for decades. Studies show worker cooperatives are more resilient during economic downturns because workers take pay cuts temporarily instead of laying each other off. They have more equal income distribution. Workers report higher job satisfaction. But cooperatives make up a tiny fraction of the economy because they're harder to start, they can't access capital markets the way corporations can, and they don't have the growth at all costs mentality that allows corporations to dominate markets. Cooperatives prioritize sustainability and worker welfare over maximum growth, which is good for workers but means they can't outcompete corporations that prioritize growth above all. So cooperatives work as an alternative model, but they can't replace corporate capitalism unless there's systemic support for them, which would require governments to deliberately favor cooperatives over corporations, and corporations use their political power to prevent that. Some people advocate for breaking up big tech and treating digital platforms as public utilities. The argument is that Google, Facebook, and Amazon are natural monopolies, like water or electricity, where one provider is more efficient than competition. But if they're monopolies, they should be regulated as utilities, or even publicly owned to serve the public interest instead of shareholder profit. This makes sense theoretically. Search, social networking, and e-commerce infrastructure are arguably public goods that everyone needs. But politically, breaking up or nationalizing trillion-dollar companies is incredibly difficult. The companies will fight with every resource they have. They'll argue it'll harm innovation, hurt consumers, and destroy shareholder value. They'll lobby Congress, they'll fund opposition campaigns, they'll threaten to move operations overseas, and they'll probably win because they have more power than the citizens and politicians trying to regulate them.
So every solution runs into the same problem. Corporations are now so powerful that they can block attempts to limit their power. This is the crisis I've been building toward. We know what the problems are. We know corporations are too big, too powerful, and too unaccountable. We know they externalize costs, exploit workers, manipulate markets, and capture regulators. We know the system is broken, but fixing it requires political power that corporations use their economic power to prevent us from accumulating. We're trapped in a system where the entities with the most power to change the rules are the ones who benefit most from the current rules. The East India Company faced this problem, and it wasn't solved until the company became so dysfunctional that even the British government couldn't ignore it anymore. But the solution was just replacing corporate rule with imperial rule. The extraction continued. We need to do better than that. We need to actually dismantle the extractive system, not just change who runs it. So what can actually work? Let me be honest, I don't know if anything can work in the sense of completely fixing the system. The problems are structural, global, and defended by the most powerful entities in human history. But I do know that some things help, some things move us in the right direction, and doing something insufficient is better than doing nothing while pretending there's no alternative. So here's what I think matters. At every level, from individual to systemic, acknowledging the limitations, but also acknowledging that change is possible if enough people commit to it. At the individual level, you can't fix corporate capitalism through ethical consumption, but you can withdraw support from the worst actors and build alternatives. Buying from worker-owned cooperatives instead of Amazon doesn't destroy Amazon, but it does strengthen cooperatives. Using privacy-respecting tools instead of Google doesn't break Google's monopoly, but it does reduce their data collection power. Organizing your workplace, even if you don't win a union immediately, builds solidarity and makes future organizing easier. These actions are insufficient by themselves, but they're not meaningless. They shift resources and power incrementally. And they build the skills, networks, and consciousness needed for larger collective action. You can also divest from corporations financially. If you have investments, you can move them out of fossil fuel companies, private prisons, weapons manufacturers, and other destructive industries. This is called divestment, and while individual divestment doesn't crash stock prices, mass divestment movements can stigmatize industries and increase their cost of capital.
The fossil fuel divestment movement has gotten trillions of dollars divested from oil and gas. That doesn't shut down the industry, but it does send a signal and makes financing new projects harder. And you can support political candidates and movements that actually challenge corporate power, not the ones who take corporate money and promise incremental reform, but the ones who advocate for breaking up monopolies, empowering labor, and transforming the economy. These candidates rarely win, but they shift the political conversation and make more radical ideas thinkable. At the collective level, labor organizing is still the most powerful tool workers have. Corporations fear unions because unions can actually force them to share profits and limit exploitation. This is why corporations spend so much on union busting. They know unions work. And recent years have seen a resurgence in labor organizing. Starbucks workers, Amazon warehouse workers, tech workers, graduate students, all organizing in industries that were previously non-union. These efforts face massive opposition, but they're happening. And if they succeed and spread, they could rebuild the worker power that balanced corporate power in the mid-1900s. Beyond traditional unions, worker cooperatives, tenant unions, and mutual aid networks build alternative structures of economic organization that don't depend on corporate employment. These are small now, but they prove that different models are possible. So every solution runs into the same problem. Corporations are now so powerful that they can block attempts to limit their power. This is the crisis I've been building toward. We know what the problems are. We know corporations are too big, too powerful, and too unaccountable. We know they externalize costs, exploit workers, manipulate markets, and capture regulators. We know the system is broken, but fixing it requires political power that corporations use their economic power to prevent us from accumulating. We're trapped in a system where the entities with the most power to change the rules are the ones who benefit most from the current rules. The East India Company faced this problem, and it wasn't solved until the company became so dysfunctional that even the British government couldn't ignore it anymore. But the solution was just replacing corporate rule with imperial rule. The extraction continued. We need to do better than that. We need to actually dismantle the extractive system, not just change who runs it. So what can actually work? Let me be honest, I don't know if anything can work in the sense of completely fixing the system. The problems are structural, global, and defended by the most powerful entities in human history. But I do know that some things help, some things move us in the right direction, and doing something insufficient is better than doing nothing while pretending there's no alternative. So here's what I think matters. At every level, from individual to systemic, acknowledging the limitations, but also acknowledging that change is possible if enough people commit to it. At the individual level, you can't fix corporate capitalism through ethical consumption, but you can withdraw support from the worst actors and build alternatives. Buying from worker-owned cooperatives instead of Amazon doesn't destroy Amazon, but it does strengthen cooperatives. Using privacy-respecting tools instead of Google doesn't break Google's monopoly, but it does reduce their data collection power. Organizing your workplace, even if you don't win a union immediately, builds solidarity and makes future organizing easier. These actions are insufficient by themselves, but they're not meaningless. They shift resources and power incrementally. And they build the skills, networks, and consciousness needed for larger collective action. You can also divest from corporations financially. If you have investments, you can move them out of fossil fuel companies, private prisons, weapons manufacturers, and other destructive industries. This is called divestment, and while individual divestment doesn't crash stock prices, mass divestment movements can stigmatize industries and increase their cost of capital. The fossil fuel divestment movement has gotten trillions of dollars divested from oil and gas. That doesn't shut down the industry, but it does send a signal and makes financing new projects harder. And you can support political candidates and movements that actually challenge corporate power, not the ones who take corporate money and promise incremental reform, but the ones who advocate for breaking up monopolies, empowering labor, and transforming the economy. These candidates rarely win, but they shift the political conversation and make more radical ideas thinkable. At the collective level, labor organizing is still the most powerful tool workers have. Corporations fear unions because unions can actually force them to share profits and limit exploitation.
This is why corporations spend so much on union busting. They know unions work. And recent years have seen a resurgence in labor organizing. Starbucks workers, Amazon warehouse workers, tech workers, graduate students, all organizing in industries that were previously non-union. These efforts face massive opposition, but they're happening. And if they succeed and spread, they could rebuild the worker power that balanced corporate power in the mid-1900s. Beyond traditional unions, worker cooperatives, tenant unions, and mutual aid networks build alternative structures of economic organization that don't depend on corporate employment. These are small now, but they prove that different models are possible.
Political organizing to demand regulation, antitrust enforcement, and corporate accountability is essential. Corporations won't regulate themselves, so we need governments to do it. But governments won't regulate corporations unless citizens demand it loudly and continuously. This means protesting, lobbying, voting, and making corporate power a central political issue. Some politicians get this. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders in the U.S. have made breaking up big tech and empowering workers central to their platforms. They haven't succeeded in implementing their full agendas, but they've moved the conversation. A decade ago, breaking up big tech was a fringe position. Now it's mainstream among progressives. That's progress. Not enough, but real. And internationally, the EU has been more aggressive on antitrust and data privacy than the US. They've fined Google billions for antitrust violations. They've passed GDPR for data protection. They're treating digital platforms more like utilities. This shows that regulation is possible when there's political will. But here's the hard truth. Individual and collective actions within the current system can only go so far. Real transformation requires changing the system itself. That means changing corporate law to eliminate limited liability or make shareholder primacy illegal. It means changing the legal status of corporations so they're not considered persons with constitutional rights. It means changing campaign finance so corporations can't buy political influence. It means changing trade agreements so countries can protect workers in industries without corporate retaliation. It means changing tax law to close loopholes and tax wealth instead of just income. It means potentially changing the economic system away from capitalism towards something that prioritizes human welfare over profit. And all of that requires political power that we don't currently have, because corporations use their power to maintain the system that gives them power. So we're back to the catch-22. To change the system, we need power. To get power, we need to organize. But corporations use their power to prevent organizing from succeeding. This is why change is so hard. But it's not impossible. History shows that systems that seem permanent do collapse. Feudalism seemed permanent until it wasn't. Slavery seemed permanent until it wasn't. Colonialism seemed permanent until it wasn't. The Soviet Union seemed permanent until it wasn't. Systems collapse when their contradictions become unsustainable and when enough people withdraw consent and build alternatives. Corporate capitalism has deep contradictions. It requires infinite growth on a finite planet. It creates inequality that destabilizes democracies. It externalizes costs that are creating ecological collapse, and it concentrates power in entities that are accountable to no one. These contradictions are getting worse. Climate change, inequality, political instability, and corporate overreach are accelerating. At some point, the system will face a crisis it can't resolve without fundamental transformation. And when that happens, whether the transformation is towards something better or something worse depends on what alternatives we've built and what political consciousness we've developed.
So what I'm saying is, the fight isn't hopeless, but it's also not going to be won easily or quickly. It's going to take decades of organizing, educating, and building alternatives. It's going to require sacrifice. People will lose jobs for organizing. They'll be blacklisted. They'll face legal retaliation. The corporations and the governments they control will fight back viciously because they're defending trillions of dollars and centuries of accumulated power. But the alternative is accepting a world where corporations extract until there's nothing left, where inequality reaches feudal levels, where democratic governance becomes impossible, and where ecological collapse makes large parts of the planet uninhabitable. That's the trajectory we're on. Changing it requires confronting corporate power directly, not through polite requests for reform, but through building enough collective power to force transformation. And this brings me to the deeper problem, the question I've been asking since the beginning. Do we accept corporations as more powerful than governments? Do we accept that the purpose of the economy is to enrich shareholders? Do we accept that profit is sacred and human life is expendable? Because that's what we've inherited from the East India Company. That's the world they built and that we're living in. And every day that we participate in this system without challenging it, we're giving consent. We're saying this is acceptable. And I don't think it is. I don't think it's acceptable that children mine cobalt for our phones. I don't think it's acceptable that people die rationing insulin. I don't think it's acceptable that private equity firms kill nursing home patients for profit. I don't think it's acceptable that corporations can lobby governments, fund campaigns, and write regulations. I don't think it's acceptable that 3 people have more wealth than half of humanity. And I don't think it's acceptable that we know all of this and just shrug and say, that's capitalism, like it's a force of nature instead of a system humans built and can change. So the question isn't just what can we do, it's what are we willing to do? Are you willing to organize your workplace, even if you might get fired? Are you willing to support political candidates who challenge corporate power, even if they can't win? Are you willing to divest from corporations, even if it means lower returns? Are you willing to buy less, consume less, and prioritize sustainability over convenience? Are you willing to protest, strike, and disrupt systems that depend on your compliance? Are you willing to educate others, even when it's uncomfortable and people don't want to hear it? Because change requires all of that. It requires people who understand the system and refuse to accept it. And it requires enough of those people acting together that corporations and governments can't ignore them. I don't know if we'll succeed. History isn't a story with a guaranteed happy ending. Lots of movements for justice have failed. Lots of people have fought corporate power and lost. The East India Company operated for 258 years before it was dissolved, and even then, the extraction continued under a different name. We might spend our entire lives fighting this system and not see it transform, but we might also be part of the generation that builds enough momentum that the next generation can finish the job. Or we might face a crisis in the next few decades, climate collapse, economic collapse, political collapse, that forces transformation whether we're ready or not. And if that happens, what comes next will depend on what we've built beforehand. If we've built cooperatives, unions, political movements, and alternative institutions, then the transformation might be toward something more just. If we haven't, then the transformation might be toward corporate feudalism or fascism or ecological catastrophe. So the work matters even if we don't see the results.
Let me end by telling you what this research has meant for me personally, because I think it's important to acknowledge how knowledge changes you. When I started researching the East India Company 4 months ago, I thought I was just making a history documentary. I knew corporations were problematic, but I didn't understand the depth of it. I didn't understand that the extractive, violent, unaccountable nature of corporations isn't a deviation from capitalism. It is capitalism. It's the original model. Everything since has just been variations on the theme the East India Company established. And understanding that has changed how I see everything. When I buy something, I think about the supply chain and who's being exploited. When I see corporate PR about sustainability or values, I know it's performance to obscure extraction. When I hear politicians talk about being pro-business, I hear them saying they're pro-extraction. I can't unknow this. And it's uncomfortable. It makes life harder because you can't participate innocently in systems you understand are exploitative. But I also think the discomfort is necessary. Comfortable ignorance is how systems of exploitation persist. People who benefit don't ask questions. And I benefit from these systems. I live in a rich country. I own devices made with conflict minerals. I've used Amazon. I've invested in stock markets. I'm complicit. And that's not a guilt trip. It's just reality. We're all embedded in systems we didn't create, but that we perpetuate through participation. And the question is what we do with that knowledge and that complicity. We can feel guilty and do nothing, which is just self-indulgent. We can deny the complicity and pretend everything is fine, which is willful ignorance. Or we can accept the complicity, understand the systems, and commit to changing them while acknowledging we'll never be pure or perfect because there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. And I choose the third option. I choose to understand, to teach others, to support alternatives when I can, to organize when possible, and to refuse to accept that this is just how things are. Because it's not. It's how things were built by people with power. And what people built, people can rebuild differently. So where does that leave you? You've spent 2 hours learning about the East India Company, corporate capitalism, extraction, monopolies, and the systemic violence that creates the comfortable lives some of us live and the poverty that billions endure. You can't unknow it now. The map has changed. Every time you see a corporation, you'll think about the East India Company. Every time you hear about monopolies, regulatory capture, or corporate lobbying, you'll recognize the pattern. Every time someone says corporations are just efficient businesses, you'll know that's a lie designed to obscure power. And you'll have to decide what you do with that knowledge. You can watch this video, feel informed, and then go back to your life unchanged. That's an option. Most people choose it. Or you can let this knowledge change you. Let it make you uncomfortable. Let it motivate you to learn more, do more, and demand more. Let it make you part of the solution instead of part of the problem. I can't tell you which to choose, but I can tell you that the world needs people who understand how systems work and refuse to accept injustice just because it's profitable for someone. The East India Company is dead, but every corporation today carries its DNA. And until we confront that, until we dismantle the structures that allow corporations to extract wealth, avoid accountability, and wield power without consent, the patterns will keep repeating. Different products, different countries, different victims, but the same underlying logic: profit over people, shareholders over citizens, extraction over sustainability. That's the legacy of the East India Company. That's what we've inherited. And the question, the only question that matters, is whether we're going to accept that inheritance or whether we're going to fight to build something different, something where the economy serves human needs instead of shareholder profits, where corporations are accountable to the people they affect, where wealth is shared instead of hoarded, where the planet is protected instead of plundered, where the purpose of business is to create value for everyone, not to extract it from the many for the benefit of the few. I don't know if that's possible, but I know it's necessary. And I know that if enough people understand the system, refuse to accept it, and commit to changing it, then maybe, just maybe, we can build an economy that doesn't require exploitation. Maybe we can create corporations that serve the public good instead of private greed. Maybe we can have prosperity without extraction. Maybe the East India Company's model can finally die instead of just evolving into new forms. Maybe.
But it starts with understanding. And now you understand. You know where corporations came from. You know what they were designed to do. You know why they behave the way they do. You know the cost of corporate power, measured in famines, coups, environmental destruction, and concentrated wealth. And you know that none of this is natural or inevitable. It's all chosen. It's all built. And what's built can be rebuilt. So that's my challenge to you. Don't just watch this and move on. Let it change you. Let it change how you see the world, how you participate in the economy, how you vote, how you organize, and what you demand from the systems that govern your life. Because if this video has done what I hoped, you're not the same person who started watching 2 hours ago. You can't be. You've seen too much. You know too much. And knowledge demands something from you. It demands that you act differently, think differently, and refuse to accept what you now know is unacceptable.
The men who ran the East India Company, Robert Clive and the directors and the shareholders, they're long dead. But the system they built is still running, still extracting, still concentrating wealth, still externalizing costs, still avoiding accountability. And it will keep running until enough people understand it and decide to shut it down. Not by violence, though the system will use violence to defend itself as it always has, but by building something better and refusing to participate in the old system, by organizing workers, by supporting cooperatives, by demanding regulation, by divesting from extraction, by making corporate power a political issue that can't be ignored, by building the movements, institutions, and consciousness needed to transform how we organize economic life. This is the work. This is what the knowledge demands. And it's hard work. It's generational work. It's work that we might not live to see completed, but it's necessary work, because the alternative is watching the world burn while shareholders collect dividends. And I can't accept that. I don't think you can either. Not anymore. Not now that you know. So welcome to your new status quo. The world looks different now. Corporations aren't just businesses anymore. They're power structures with a history of violence and extraction. And you're part of the story now. What happens next depends on what you do with what you know. The East India Company wrote the first chapters. We're writing the next ones. And the ending isn't written yet. Make it a good one.